I need to tell you something about the Great Smoky Mountains that people who visit for a weekend don't understand, and that even people who hike there regularly sometimes fail to appreciate. The Smokies are old. Not old the way a building is old or a city is old, but old the way the ocean is old. Old in a way that predates the category of oldness. Mountains that were ancient before the Rockies were a wrinkle in the Earth's crust, and that have been wearing down and settling into themselves for so long that the stone has achieved a kind of patience that you can feel in your bones. When you're deep enough in the backcountry and far enough from the roads and the visitor centers and the carefully maintained illusion that these mountains are something humans have tamed. They haven't been tamed. They've been decorated. The trails and the shelters and the signs are ornaments hung on something vast and indifferent. And when you step off those trails, when you move past the blazes and the maintained tread into the spaces between, you enter a place that operates on rules you don't fully understand, and that has no obligation to behave the way you expect it to. I've been backpacking in the Smokies since I was 19. 12 years of weekends and week-long trips, and the occasional solo expedition that took me into sections of the park that see maybe a handful of visitors a year. I knew the trail system the way a cab driver knows the streets of their city. Not just the main routes, but the connectors, the unmaintained manways, the old railroad grades and herding paths that crisscross the mountains beneath the official trail network, like the veins beneath skin. I'd hiked the Appalachian Trail through the park end to end 4 times. I'd done every named trail in the system at least once. I carried the confidence of deep familiarity, the certainty that comes from years of repetition, from knowing that the next bend will show you a creek crossing you've seen before, that the ridge ahead will break to the left exactly where it broke to the left last time, that the mountain is a known quantity that holds no surprises for someone who's paid the kind of attention I'd paid. That confidence is what made September of 2020 so destabilizing. Not the experience itself, though the experience was frightening in ways I'm still trying to articulate, but the destruction of certainty, the realization that a place I thought I knew completely could present me with something I'd never seen, something that wasn't supposed to be there, something that operated outside the framework of trail and map and GPS that I'd built my understanding on. That's what stays with me. Not the fear, but the doubt, the knowledge that the mountains I'd trusted contain spaces I can't account for. I left Clingman's Dome on a Tuesday morning in mid-September, planning a 3-day solo trip to Newfound Gap along a route that followed the AT for most of its distance, but included a detour through the Goshen Prong drainage, where I wanted to check on a backcountry campsite I'd used the previous year. The weather was good, clear skies, temperatures in the mid-60s, the kind of September perfection that the Smokies produce between the heat of summer and the unpredictability of fall. I was carrying a standard overnight pack, maybe 35 pounds, with 3 days of food and the usual gear. I'd filed a trip plan with the backcountry office and told my girlfriend I'd be back Thursday evening. Everything was by the book. Everything was routine. The first day was uneventful. I made good time along the AT, passing a few day hikers near Clingman's, and then settling into the solitude that builds as you move away from the popular trailheads. By late afternoon, I'd reached the Goshen Prong Junction and turned south, dropping off the ridge into the drainage on a trail that I'd hiked 3 or 4 times before. The trail was narrow but clear, following the creek downstream through a forest of old-growth spruce and fir that blocked most of the sky and created a green twilight on the forest floor even in the middle of the day. I set up camp at my usual spot near the creek, ate dinner, hung my bear bag, and fell asleep to the sound of water running over rocks, which is the best sleep aid the natural world has ever produced. Wednesday morning, I packed up and started back toward the AT, climbing out of the drainage on the trail I'd descended the day before. The climb was steep but familiar, the switchbacks coming where I expected them, the landmarks appearing in the right order, a lightning-scarred hemlock, a rock outcrop with a view of the drainage below, a small seep where the trail crossed a wet area on a series of flat stones. Everything was normal. Everything was where it should have been. I was about 40 minutes into the climb, maybe a mile and a half from the AT junction, when I realized I'd missed something. The trail forked. A junction that I didn't recognize. A point where the path I was on split into 2 clear branches, one continuing uphill to the left and the other turning right and contouring along the slope to the northeast. Both branches looked maintained, cleared brush, visible tread, and on the right branch, blazes. Orange blazes on the trees, evenly spaced, the kind of marking you see on maintained trails throughout the park system. But I'd never seen this junction before. In 3 or 4 previous trips through this exact section of trail, there had been no fork here, just the single trail climbing to the AT. I stopped and pulled out my map. The topographic sheet showed one trail through the Goshen Prong drainage, the one I'd been on, climbing straight to the AT with no junctions, no branches, no alternative routes. I checked my GPS. According to the screen, I was standing in the middle of an untracked forest, no trail beneath me, no junction, no feature that corresponded to what I was seeing with my own eyes. I should have taken the left branch. I should have continued uphill, followed the route I knew, ignored the junction that my map said didn't exist and my GPS couldn't see. But the orange blazes on the right branch drew me. They were fresh, the paint bright against the bark, and they marked a trail that was clearly maintained and clearly used. And the part of my brain that had spent 12 years cataloging every trail in these mountains wanted to know where it went. I told myself I'd follow it for 30 minutes and turn back if it didn't connect to anything familiar. The trail was well built. The tread was smooth and clear, the corridor cut wide enough for comfortable walking, the blazes appearing at regular intervals on trees that looked like they'd been marked recently. The path contoured along the slope at a fairly level grade, winding through dense forest, and the walking was easy and pleasant despite the nagging unease produced by my map's insistence that this trail didn't exist. I noted landmarks as I walked a distinctive rock formation, a massive fallen tree that I had to climb over, a patch of mud where I left a clear boot print. After about 45 minutes, I passed a small clearing where I dropped a granola bar wrapper. I'd noticed it falling from my pocket and had made a mental note to pick it up on my way back, marking it as a landmark in my memory. 30 minutes after the clearing, the trail curved to the right and began a gentle descent. I checked the GPS again. It showed me in an open forest, maybe half a mile east of the Goshen Prong Trail, which, according to the device, was behind me and to the left. The GPS track showed a meandering line through unmarked terrain, the path of someone who was not on any trail at all. I was getting ready to turn back when I came around a bend and found the mud patch. My boot print was in it, the distinctive waffle pattern of my hiking boots, pressed into the soft earth, pointed in the direction I was currently walking. And beside the trail, on the ground among the leaves, was my granola bar wrapper. I stood there for a long time. The implications took a moment to assemble themselves, because my brain was resisting them, trying to construct alternative explanations the way you try to hold water in a cracked cup. Someone else had the same boots. Someone else had dropped the same brand of granola bar. The mud patch looked different from what I remembered. None of these held. The boot print was mine, the wrapper was mine, and I was standing in a place I'd stood approximately an hour and a half earlier, having walked a route that had brought me in a circle back to my own tracks. I'd walked a loop, a closed circuit, maybe 2 miles in circumference, through forest that my GPS couldn't map and my topographic sheet didn't acknowledge. A trail that connected to nothing except itself, a path that went somewhere and arrived back at where it started. I tried again. I walked the loop deliberately this time, watching for the junction that would let me break free, looking for any branch or fork that I might have missed. I found nothing. The trail was continuous, unbroken, a single path that curved through the forest in a gentle arc that always, inevitably, brought me back to the mud patch with my boot print and the granola bar wrapper that was becoming a monument to my confusion. The third time I reached it, I sat down on a log and drank water and tried to think clearly about what was happening. The forest around the trail was impenetrable. Rhododendron thickets, the kind that grow in the Smokies like vegetable barbed wire, dense and interlocking and thorned, creating walls of green on both sides of the trail that would require serious effort to push through. I could have done it. I had the physical ability to leave the trail and fight through the rhododendron to the open forest beyond. But something stopped me, and I'm not sure it was rational. It was a feeling, a sense that the trail existed for a reason, and that leaving it would not put me in the forest I expected, but somewhere else, somewhere the rhododendron was guarding against rather than simply growing in. On my fourth pass through the loop, I noticed the campsite. It was maybe 30 feet off the trail, in a small flat area between 2 large hemlocks. I'd passed this point 3 times already and hadn't seen it, which meant either I'd been too focused on the trail to notice, or it hadn't been visible before, and I don't know which possibility disturbs me more. The The campsite was clearly old. Not decades old, but months. A tent was pitched on the flat area. A small backpacking tent, its rain fly still in place, but sagging with the weight of accumulated leaf litter and mildew. The fabric had that weathered look of nylon that's been exposed to sun and rain for an extended period. The color faded from what had probably been green to a washed-out gray-green. I approached carefully, calling out even though I didn't expect a response and didn't get one. The tent's vestibule was unzipped, and I could see inside. A sleeping bag, compressed and mildewed, a foam pad, a water bottle, still half full, the water cloudy with age, a headlamp with corroded batteries. Outside the tent, a backpack leaned against one of the hemlocks, its straps loose, its pockets open. A camp stove sat on a flat rock, a fuel canister still attached. A stuff sack that had contained food hung from a branch, shredded by animals, its contents long since consumed. Someone had made camp here, had pitched their tent and laid out their gear and set up their stove and hung their food and then had not packed out. Had left everything behind, the tent still standing, the pack still leaning, the sleeping bag still spread, as if they'd stepped away from camp for a moment and never returned. Or as if they'd been walking the loop the way I was walking it, around and around, looking for the exit that didn't exist, and had eventually stopped and set up camp and waited. I looked in the backpack. Inside was a map, folded to the Goshen Prong section, with a pencil line drawn on it that I recognized as the loop I'd been walking. The line was drawn over blank space on the map, a circle traced over terrain that the cartographers showed as featureless forest, just as my own map did. Whoever had drawn this line had found the same trail I'd found, and had walked it enough times to know its exact shape, and had documented it on a map that said it didn't exist. There was a small notebook in the pack's brain, the kind of journal hikers carry. I opened it. The entries were dated, starting in April of that year, 5 months earlier. The handwriting was neat, the entries brief, describing a solo backpacking trip that matched the route I'd been hiking. The last few entries were increasingly terse and increasingly frightened. The final entry read, "4th day on the loop, can't find the junction. Rhododendron is too thick to push through. Trail brings me back every time. Someone will find this camp. Someone will walk this trail. If you're reading this, don't follow the blazes. Go through the rhododendron. The trail wants you to stay on it. Don't stay on it. Get off the trail. Get off now." I closed the notebook and put it back in the pack, and I looked at the rhododendron wall that flanked the trail on both sides, dense and dark and unwelcoming, and I made a decision that I believe saved my life. I left the trail. I pushed into the rhododendron to the west, in the direction of the Goshen Prong Trail that my GPS said was half a mile away, and I fought through the thicket with everything I had. The branches grabbed at my pack and scratched my face and arms, and the trunks were so close together I had to turn sideways to squeeze between them, and the ground beneath was slick with rotting leaves, and I couldn't see more than 5 feet in any direction. I pushed through for what felt like an eternity. Why? And it was probably 20 minutes. And then suddenly the rhododendron thinned, and I was standing on a trail I recognized. The Goshen Prong Trail, exactly where my GPS said it should be, was marked with the familiar white diamond blazes of the maintained trail system. I was out. I hiked to the AT and then to Newfound Gap without stopping, covering the remaining distance in a sustained rush of adrenaline and relief. I drove home that night instead of spending the 3rd day on the trail. I reported the abandoned campsite to the backcountry office, giving them the GPS coordinates as best I could. A ranger went to investigate 3 days later and found nothing. No campsite, no tent, no backpack, no journal, just forest. Just rhododendron and hemlock, and the quiet indifference of mountains that have been keeping their own counsel since before humans walked upright. I went back to the Goshen Prong Junction the following spring. I hiked the same trail, climbed the same switchbacks, passed the same landmarks. The fork wasn't there, just the single trail climbing to the AT, the same trail that had always been there, with no branch, no orange blazes, no path contouring to the northeast. The forest where I'd walked the loop was a solid rhododendron thicket, impenetrable, showing no gap or corridor that a trail could have occupied. I never found out who left that campsite. I checked missing persons reports for the park, looking for anyone reported overdue from a solo trip in the Goshen Prong area in the spring or summer of 2020. I found one. A hiker from Knoxville, a 31-year-old man who'd filed a trip plan for a solo overnight in the Goshen Prong drainage in late April and had never checked out. A search had been conducted and had found no trace of him. The case was still open. I think about him. I think about him walking that loop, around and around, passing the same landmarks, looking for the junction that would let him out. I think about him setting up camp when exhaustion finally won, pitching his tent beside the trail and writing in his journal, leaving instructions for the next person who found themselves trapped on a trail that went nowhere and everywhere at once. I think about his final entry, the desperation in those words, the plea to leave the trail, to push through the rhododendron regardless of how impenetrable it seemed. I think about whether he ever took his own advice, whether he fought through the thicket the way I did and came out on the other side, or whether he's still in there, somewhere in the space between the loop trail and the real trail, in a fold of the forest that the maps can't see and the GPS can't reach, walking a circuit through mountains that decided to keep him. I don't hike the Goshen Prong anymore. I tell people it's because the trail is too steep, the drainage too remote, the solitude too heavy. But the truth is simpler and worse. I'm afraid of finding the fork again. Afraid of seeing those orange blazes on the trees, fresh and bright, marking a trail that leads nowhere except back to itself. Afraid of walking a path that the mountains built for no reason I can understand, a closed loop in the heart of the oldest mountains on the continent, patient and waiting and perfectly circular. And I'm afraid that next time, the rhododendron won't let me through. The first thing you need to understand about a fire lookout tower is the glass. 14 feet by 14 feet, a single room elevated on stilts, anywhere from 10 to 60 feet above the ground, and every wall is a window. During the day, this is the point. You're there to see, and the glass gives you a 360-degree view of whatever landscape the Forest Service has decided needs watching. You can see storms building 50 miles away. You can spot a column of smoke the width of a pencil at 15 miles, if the air is clear enough. You exist in a bubble of visibility, suspended above the world, and the clarity of it is addictive. The feeling that nothing can happen within your range of sight without your knowledge, that the landscape is yours to monitor and protect, and that the glass walls that surround you are instruments of power rather than vulnerability. At night, the glass inverts. Every window becomes a mirror. The lamps inside the tower, even a single candle, turn those transparent walls into reflective surfaces that show you nothing but yourself and the room you're sitting in, repeated in every direction, your own face staring back at you from four sides, while the world outside disappears into a darkness so complete it might as well be solid. You can press your face against the glass and cup your hands around your eyes, and sometimes you can see the silhouette of the ridge or the outline of trees against a slightly lighter sky, but mostly what you see is nothing, and in that nothing, your imagination begins to work. It populates the darkness with shapes your eyes can't confirm or deny. It puts sounds in the silence, footsteps on the catwalk, breathing below the floor, the creak of the stairs that lead up from the ground. The first summer I spent in that tower, I learned to sleep with the lights off, because darkness inside and darkness outside created a kind of equilibrium, a mutual blindness that felt safer than the alternative of sitting in a lit room surrounded by mirrors that showed me my own growing unease while hiding whatever might be standing 3 feet away on the other side of the glass. I took the job because I was 24, and I just finished a degree in forestry. Why? And I wanted to be alone. That's the simplest explanation and the truest one. I'd grown up in a loud household in Billings, shared dorm rooms for 4 years, and worked summer jobs on trail crews where you were never more than arm's length from another person. The lookout position offered me something I'd been craving, without knowing how to name it, a solitude so thorough that it restructured your relationship with your own mind, that forced you to become the only company you had, that stripped away the social performance of daily life, and left you with whatever was underneath. Some people can't handle it. The Forest Service told me that a significant percentage of lookouts quit within the first 2 weeks, unable to tolerate the silence and the isolation and the particular psychological weight of being the only human being for miles in every direction. I loved it. At least, I loved it for the first summer and most of the second, until the light appeared and the love curdled into something else. The tower was on Wapiti Ridge in the Shoshone National Forest, southeast of Yellowstone, at an elevation of just over 9,000 feet. The ridge ran roughly north-south, a spine of rock and alpine meadow with the Absaroka Range visible to the west and the Bighorn Basin stretching away to the east, and on clear days, I could see 100 miles in every direction. The tower itself was a standard Forest Service L4 design, the 14x14 cab, on a 40-foot steel frame, accessed by a staircase that zigzagged up the outside of the structure to a catwalk that wrapped around the cab at the top. The catwalk was maybe 3 feet wide, a narrow platform with a railing, and it served as both entrance and emergency exit, and the place where I'd stand in the evenings and watch the sun go down over the Absarokas, while the temperature dropped and the sky turned colors that I still don't have words for. My routine was simple and didn't vary much from day to day. Wake at dawn, coffee on the propane stove, begin scanning at first light, using the Osborne Firefinder, a circular sighting device mounted on a table in the center of the cab, to check for smoke in all directions. Radio the district office with a morning weather report. Scan again at midday, again in the late afternoon. Log any aircraft, any lightning, any unusual activity. Read, think, exist. The days had a meditative quality that I treasured, each one a copy of the last. The sameness not boring but calming. The way a heartbeat is calming, the steady repetition of a pattern that means everything is working as it should. August of my second summer. The wildfire season had been moderate, a few small starts from lightning that the crews had caught early. Nothing that threatened to blow up into a major incident. I'd been on the tower since mid-June and had settled into the deep rhythms of the season, the long days and the cool nights and the slow march of summer toward fall that you could track in the changing light and the first yellow patches appearing in the aspen groves below the ridge. I was sleeping well, eating well, feeling the kind of mental clarity that comes from 2 months of solitude and physical routine. I was, by any measure I knew how to apply, in the best psychological condition of my life. The light first appeared on August 14th. I know the date because I logged it, the way I logged everything: weather, smoke sightings, aircraft, anything out of the ordinary. It was 7 inches the morning, and I was awake because the wind had picked up and was rattling the cab in a way that sometimes woke me, even after weeks of sleeping through the normal creaks and groans of the structure. I was lying in my cot in the dark, listening to the wind, when I noticed a glow outside the south-facing windows. I got up and went to the glass. The wind had swept the sky clear, and there were stars, but the glow wasn't starlight. It was below me, on the ridge, maybe a quarter mile to the south, a pale, steady light that sat on the ground or close to it, not flickering the way a campfire flickers, not moving the way a flashlight moves, just sitting there, a constant luminous presence in a location where there should have been nothing but rock and grass and the darkness of a mountain ridge at 2 in the morning. I watched it for maybe 10 minutes, trying to determine its nature. The color was wrong for firelight, too white, too even, without the warm orange tones of combustion. It was wrong for a flashlight or a lantern, which would have been more focused, more directional. This was diffuse, a soft glow that illuminated nothing around it, that seemed to exist for its own sake rather than to provide light in any functional sense. I picked up the binoculars and focused on it. Through the lenses, the light was slightly brighter but no more detailed. Just a glow, sourceless and steady, sitting on the ridge in the dark. At 2 to 5, it went out. Not gradually, not fading, just gone, as if a switch had been flipped. One moment it was there, and the next the ridge was dark, and there was nothing to see except the stars and the black shapes of the mountains against the slightly less black sky. I logged it and went back to bed. In the morning, I radioed the district office and reported an unexplained light on the ridge. The dispatcher relayed the information to the district ranger, who called me back that afternoon. He said it was probably a hunter scouting the area before the season, using a lantern. I pointed out that hunting season was 3 weeks away and that the light hadn't moved the way a person with a lantern would move. He said people did all kinds of things in the backcountry and that I shouldn't worry about it unless it was accompanied by smoke. The light appeared again the next night. Same time, 2/7, same location, same pale, steady glow, same duration, exactly 45 minutes, going out at 2:52. I timed it with my watch, sitting in the dark cab with the binoculars, watching a light that shouldn't have been there behave with a regularity that no human activity could explain. Campfires don't ignite and extinguish on a 45-minute schedule. Lanterns don't appear and disappear at the same time on consecutive nights. Whatever this was, it was operating on a pattern, a cycle, a precision that felt mechanical rather than human. I reported it again. The ranger said he'd send someone to investigate. I asked when. He said as soon as he could spare a person, which in the middle of fire season meant not soon. I didn't push it. I was a seasonal employee, 24 years old, at the bottom of the organizational hierarchy. My job was to watch and report, not to investigate. The third night, I was ready. I'd positioned my chair at the south window, binoculars in my lap, watch on the table beside me. At 2:07, the light appeared. Same place, same quality. I brought the binoculars up, focused and watched. For 43 minutes, I saw what I'd seen the previous nights. A pale glow on the ridge, steady and sourceless, illuminating nothing, existing in isolation against the dark mountain. I was beginning to think the 45 minutes would pass without incident when, at approximately 2:50, something changed. Something moved between the light and my tower. It was a silhouette, a dark shape that crossed between me and the glow, blocking it for perhaps half a second before the light was visible again. The blockage was complete. Whatever had passed between us was solid, opaque, large enough to occlude the entire light source in a single step. My brain immediately tried to calculate the geometry. The light was a quarter-mile away, maybe 1,300 feet. For something to block it completely at that distance, it would need to be very large or very close. If it were at the light source, on the ridge a quarter-mile away, it would need to be enormous, impossibly tall, to block the glow from my elevated angle in the tower. But if it were close to me, on the catwalk perhaps, or on the ground at the base of the tower, it would only need to be the size of a person. And then I heard the catwalk creak, not the wind. I knew wind sounds. I'd spent 2 summers cataloging every noise the tower made in every weather condition, and this was not wind on the catwalk. This was weight. The specific groan of the metal grating under something heavy enough to flex it, a sound I heard every day when I stepped out to do my visual scan, a sound that my own body produced when I walked the narrow platform around the cab. Weight on the catwalk, something standing outside, 3 feet from the glass, on a platform 40 feet above the ground, at 2:50 inches the morning. I didn't move. I sat in my chair in the dark cab with the binoculars in my lap, and I didn't move, and I didn't breathe, and I stared at the south window where the light on the ridge was still visible. E and I listened to the catwalk bearing weight that wasn't mine. The creak came again, a slight shift, the sound of something adjusting its position. Then another creak, further along the catwalk, moving. Moving around the cab, from south to west, a slow, deliberate progression of weight on metal that tracked around the outside of the glass room, where I sat motionless in the dark. I didn't turn on a light. I understood with perfect clarity that if I turned on a light, the glass would become a mirror on my side and a window on theirs, and I would see nothing, while whatever was on the catwalk would see everything: me, the room, the chair, the binoculars, the cot, every detail of my small illuminated life, exposed to something standing in the dark 3 feet away. The darkness was my only protection. As long as the cab was dark, as long as I was invisible, the glass worked in my favor. I could see out, however dimly, and whatever was outside could not see in. The creaking continued around the catwalk, west to north. Slow, measured, each sound followed by a pause, as if the thing was stopping at each window to look in, pressing close to the glass, trying to see through the darkness into the room where it knew I was sitting. I could feel it at each window, a presence that registered not as sight but as pressure, a subtle intensification of the darkness on the other side of the glass, as if the night itself was leaning against the tower, curious, patient, trying to determine what was inside. It completed a full circuit, south to west to north to east and back to south, maybe 3 minutes for the full loop. Then it stopped. The catwalk was silent. The light on the ridge was still glowing, steady and pale, and I sat in my chair and waited and heard nothing for what felt like hours, but was probably 5 minutes. Then, at 2:52, the light went out. The same precise moment it had gone out every night. And with it, the presence on the catwalk vanished. Not departed, vanished. There was no sound of footsteps descending the stairs, no creak of weight moving away, no indication that anything physical left the platform. The pressure simply ceased. The darkness outside the windows returned to normal darkness, the neutral, empty dark of a mountain night, and the tower was just a tower again, a glass room on stilts with one frightened person inside it. I didn't sleep. I sat in that chair until dawn broke, and the windows filled with gray light, and I could see the catwalk outside, empty, the metal grating showing nothing, no marks, no disturbance, no indication that anything had been there. I went outside and walked the full perimeter. Nothing. I descended the stairs and checked the ground at the base of the tower. The area was dry and rocky, poor tracking ground, but I found nothing that suggested a presence. No prints, no disturbed vegetation, nothing. I radioed the district office and reported what had happened. I kept my voice calm and my language precise, and I described the light and the sound on the catwalk and the circuit around the cab without embellishment or interpretation. The ranger listened and was quiet for a long time, and then he asked me if I'd been drinking. I said no. He asked if I'd been sleeping well. I said yes, until last night. He said he'd send someone up to check on me. Nobody came. Fire season was at its peak, and every available person was committed to an incident near Dubois, and sending someone to investigate a spooked lookout story about lights and noises was not a priority. I understood the calculation. I understood it, and I resented it, and I was terrified of what the fourth night would bring. On the fourth night, I didn't wait in the dark. I made a decision that went against every instinct I had, a decision born of the understanding that I could not spend another night sitting in a dark room listening to something walk around the outside of my glass cage. I turned on every light in the cab, both propane lamps, the LED lantern, and even a candle. I made the room as bright as I could, and I sat in the center of it, visible from every direction, and I waited. At 2:07, the light appeared on the ridge. I watched it through the now reflective glass, my own face ghosted over the distant glow, and I waited for the catwalk to creak. It didn't. For 45 minutes, I sat in my lit room and watched the light and heard nothing on the catwalk and felt no presence at the windows. At 2:52, the light went out and the night was quiet, and nothing walked the platform outside my door. I thought it was over. I thought the lights had deterred it, that whatever had been drawn to my tower was repelled by illumination, that I'd found the countermeasure and could sleep safely for the remainder of the season. Then I looked at the windows more carefully, at the glass surface closest to my chair. On the outside, where the night pressed against the pane, there were marks on the glass. Not scratches, not smudges from my own hands. Prints. Long, narrow marks pressed against the exterior surface, as if something had placed its hands flat against the glass and held them there while it looked in at me, at my lit room, at my brightly illuminated life, studying me with the patience of something that had all the time in the world and didn't mind being seen, because being seen was not the same as being understood. I left the tower 4 days later. I told the district ranger I had a family emergency and needed to come down early. He didn't argue. Seasonal lookouts quit all the time. The tower would be closed for the season in 3 weeks anyway. I packed my personal gear and hiked down the ridge to the trailhead, drove to Billings, and didn't look back. I've never returned to Wapiti Ridge. I've never taken another lookout position. I finished my forestry degree and work for a state agency now, a desk job in Helena that keeps me in an office with solid walls and no windows after dark, and colleagues who fill the silence with the ordinary sounds of human activity. I sleep with the lights off again, mostly, though on some nights when the wind picks up and the house creaks in ways that sound like weight on a platform, I'll leave the hallway light on, and I'll lie in bed and listen and tell myself that there's nothing outside, that glass is just glass, that the darkness beyond it is empty. But I know about the handprints. I know something stood on that catwalk and pressed its hands against the glass and looked in at me with a patience that suggested not curiosity but ownership, as if the ridge and the tower and the darkness were its territory, and I was the anomaly, the temporary intrusion, the thing that would eventually leave while it remained, watching, waiting, returning to the ridge every night at 2:07 to light a pale glow that served no purpose I could understand. And that went out at 2:52 every night with the precision of something that had been doing it for longer than fire towers had existed on that ridge. I don't know what it was. I don't know what it wanted. I don't know if the light was bait or signal or something else entirely, some function of its existence that had nothing to do with me and that I was simply close enough to witness. All I know is that for 3 nights, something climbed 40 feet of steel stairs and walked the catwalk of a fire lookout tower at 9,000 feet in the Absaroka Range and looked through the glass at a 24-year-old kid who wanted nothing more than to be alone, and that on the fourth night it left its handprints on the window to let me know that the glass between us was thinner than I thought. And sometimes, on the worst nights, I wonder if it's still there, still on that ridge, still lighting its pale glow at 2-7, still climbing the stairs of a tower that's been empty since I left, still walking the catwalk, still pressing its hands against glass that shows it nothing but an empty room and the darkness on the other side, still watching, still patient, still waiting for someone to turn on the lights. Elkmont Campground is one of the most popular campgrounds in the most visited national park in America, which means that getting a site there in July requires planning, persistence, and the willingness to sit at your computer at exactly 10 in the morning, 60 days before your target date, and refresh the reservation page until a spot opens up. My wife Karen and I had done this dance 3 years running, and we'd gotten good at it, snagging site 27, our preferred spot on the outer loop, a pull-through with good shade and a flat tent pad, and enough distance from the neighbors that you could pretend you were somewhere wilder than a campground that hosts 300 people on a busy weekend. We'd booked it for the third weekend in July, confirmed the reservation twice, and driven down from Knoxville on a Friday afternoon with the car packed and the cooler full, and the comfortable anticipation of a weekend doing nothing in the mountains. The drive through the park was normal. Traffic on Little River Road, tourists pulling off at every waterfall, the usual summer chaos that funnels toward Elkmont through a narrow valley that was never designed for the volume of vehicles it now carries. We turned onto the Elkmont access road around 6 in the evening, the sun still well above the ridgeline, the light golden and warm through the hardwood canopy. The road climbed gently through forest that was beautiful in the way only the Smokies manage, that particular combination of density and light and age that makes you feel like you're driving through something alive rather than through a landscape. The gate was open. That was the first thing I noted, and it meant nothing by itself. The gate was always open during camping season, closed only during winter months or when the campground was full and no more vehicles could be accommodated. I turned in and started up the loop road toward our site, and within 30 seconds, I knew something was wrong. The campground was empty, not partially occupied, not quiet, not winding down from a weekday lull. Empty. Every site I passed was vacant, no tents, no RVs, no pop-ups, no vehicles of any kind. The picnic tables sat bare on their concrete pads. The fire rings held gray ash that looked old, undisturbed, the ash of fires that had burned days or weeks ago, rather than the fresh remains of last night's campfire. The garbage bins at the comfort stations were empty, their lids propped open, their liners clean. The bathroom lights were on, the buildings clearly functional, the water running when I checked, but the campground itself was devoid of human presence in a way that felt not just unusual but impossible. I drove the entire loop, all 43 sites, outer loop and inner loop, every pull-through, back-in, and walk-in site that the campground offered. Nothing, no gear, no vehicles, no evidence of recent occupation. The self-pay station near the entrance was stocked with fresh envelopes and a working pen on a chain, and a notice board showing the campground rules and a map of the sites. Everything operational, everything ready. Everything was aiding for people who weren't there. Karen said maybe there was a closure we didn't know about. I checked my phone. We had a weak signal, enough to pull up the reservation confirmation. It was still there, Site 27, Friday through Sunday, paid in full. I checked the campground status on the park website. It showed full capacity. Every site is booked. 312 people should have been here, according to the system, and we were the only two. We pulled into 27 and sat in the car for a few minutes, not talking, both of us processing the strangeness through our own particular filters. Karen is more practical than I am, more inclined to seek rational explanations, and she was scrolling through her phone, looking for alerts, closures, anything that would explain why a campground that was supposed to be at capacity on a July weekend was instead as vacant as a parking lot at 3 in the morning. She found nothing, no alerts, no closures, no explanation. We set up camp. I don't know why. The reasonable thing would have been to leave, to drive back to the ranger station and ask questions, to find someone in a uniform who could tell us what was happening. But the evening was beautiful, the site was ours, and the inertia of having planned a weekend and driven an hour and packed a cooler full of food was enough to override the unease. We pitched the tent, arranged the camp chairs, and started a fire in the ring. Karen made dinner on the camp stove while I walked to the comfort station for water, and walking through that empty campground in the fading light was one of the strangest experiences of my life. The sites were all around me, each one set up for occupancy, each one showing the infrastructure of hospitality table, fire ring, tent pad, parking spur, and each one empty, silent, unused. It felt like walking through a movie set after the crew had gone home. Everything was there except the life that was supposed to fill it. We ate dinner, sat by the fire, and watched the light die over the ridgeline to the west. The campground settled into darkness, with none of the usual sounds that accompany a busy summer evening. No kids laughing, no generators humming, no murmured conversations from neighboring sites, no car doors closing, no music playing from someone's portable speaker. Just us and the fire and the creek that ran behind the campground, audible now that there were no competing sounds, and the forest that rose the slopes on every side, dark and dense, and watching us the way forests watch when they think you're not paying attention. We went to bed around 10. I zipped the tent and lay on my sleeping pad and listened to the silence, and tried to convince myself that there was an explanation and that we'd learn it in the morning and laugh about it. Karen fell asleep before me, her breathing settling into that slow, even rhythm that I found comforting on normal nights, and that tonight felt fragile, like something I needed to protect. She woke me at 11, her hand on my arm, firm, insistent, and when I opened my eyes, she was sitting up in her sleeping bag, her face barely visible in the ambient dark, and she was pointing at the back wall of the tent, toward the tree line that bordered the rear of Site 27. I looked. Through the mesh window of the tent, I could see the tree line, the dark vertical shapes of trunks, and the darker mass of canopy above, and among them, moving slowly between the trunks, lights. Not flashlights, not lanterns, not any kind of light that I could associate with a device or a source. They were pale, roughly spherical, maybe the size of a softball, and they were drifting through the forest at about chest height, 3 or 4 feet above the ground, moving in the same direction, all of them heading upslope toward the northeast, toward the old Elkmont settlement, the abandoned vacation community that the park had been slowly demolishing for decades. There were dozens of them. I tried to count and lost track at 30 because they were spaced irregularly through the trees, and more kept appearing at the lower edge of the slope as I watched, emerging from the direction of the creek and moving uphill with a steady, unhurried pace that suggested not wind or current but intention. They made no sound. That was the detail that pressed hardest against my attempts at rational explanation. Lights that move through a forest should be accompanied by something: footsteps, voices, the rustle of brush being pushed aside. These were silent. They drifted between the trunks without disturbing a branch, without rustling a leaf, without producing any sound that reached us through the tent's thin walls. And they cast no light on their surroundings. That was the other thing. A light source illuminates what's near it. These didn't. The trees around them remained dark. The ground beneath them remained dark. They existed as self-contained glows that provided no illumination to anything except themselves, pale spheres moving through absolute darkness without affecting it. We watched for maybe 20 minutes. Neither of us spoke. The lights continued their procession, flowing up the slope in a steady stream, all moving in the same direction, all traveling at the same pace, dozens of them passing through the tree line behind our campsite like a silent migration. Some passed within 30 feet of our tent. I could see them clearly through the mesh, each one distinct, each one pale and steady, each one moving with a purpose that felt ancient and absolute, and entirely unconcerned with the two people watching from a nylon shelter in a campground that had been emptied for their passage. I understood then, not intellectually, not in any way I could have explained to someone who wasn't there, but in a deeper register, in the part of the mind that recognizes patterns too large for conscious thought. I understood why the campground was empty, why 312 reservations had somehow failed to materialize, why the gate was open, but the sites were vacant, and the ash in the fire rings was old. And the silence was so complete it felt curated. This night belonged to whatever was moving through the forest. This night had been cleared, the way a street is cleared for a parade, the way a room is cleared before a ceremony. Whatever was processing up that slope toward the old settlement had right of way, had claimed this date on some calendar that predated the reservation system, and the campground, and the park itself, and the systems that humans had built, the websites, the booking software, The infrastructure of recreation and tourism had somehow accommodated the claim, had emptied the campground of 300 people without anyone noticing, without anyone questioning, without a single alert or closure notice being issued. The last light passed through the trees around midnight. The forest was dark again, the slope empty, the silence gradually filling with the normal sounds of a July night: crickets, the creek, a distant owl. The campground felt different after the lights had passed, lighter somehow, as if a pressure had been released, as if the held breath of the place had finally been exhaled. We didn't sleep. We lay in the tent until dawn, and then we packed up and drove out without speaking. The ranger station was staffed when we passed it, and I thought about stopping, about asking whether anyone else had reported the campground being empty, about describing the lights. But I didn't stop. I didn't stop because I knew what the ranger would say, that the campground had been full, that they'd had no reports of vacancy, that whatever I'd experienced was a misunderstanding or a mistake, and maybe they'd be right. Maybe on their screens and in their records, the campground had been occupied, all 43 sites filled with the families and couples and solo campers who'd booked them months in advance. Maybe we were the only ones who'd experienced the vacancy, the only ones who'd arrived to find the campground cleared and waiting. I checked the reservation system when we got home. Our booking showed as completed, Site 27, Friday through Sunday. And the campground status for that weekend showed what it always showed in July: full capacity, every site occupied, the most popular campground in the most visited park in America doing what it was supposed to do. But we were there. We were the only ones. And the lights that moved through the forest that night moved with a certainty that told me this wasn't an anomaly, but a recurrence. Something that happened on a schedule I couldn't access, something that the mountain and the forest and maybe even the reservation system honored without question. I don't book Elkmont anymore. I don't camp in the Smokies in July. And when Karen and I talk about that night, which we do rarely and carefully, we don't try to explain it. We just acknowledge that something used that campground, that slope, that path through the trees, on a night in July, and that whatever it was had been doing it for longer than campgrounds or parks or people had existed in those mountains. And the campground was cleared for them, every time, without anyone ever knowing why. I worked seasonal positions at Shenandoah National Park for 3 summers, 2016 through 2018, the kind of entry-level ranger work that involves trail maintenance, visitor contact, campground patrols, and the occasional backcountry assignment that takes you deep enough into the park that the Blue Ridge Parkway and the lodge and the overlooks, with their tour buses, feel like they belong to a different world. Shenandoah is a deceptive park. It sits close to Washington, close to population centers that pour millions of visitors onto Skyline Drive every year, and the front country experience is civilized enough that people think they know the place after a weekend of driving and a couple of short hikes to waterfalls. They don't. The backcountry of Shenandoah is as wild and remote as anything in the Appalachians. Hollows that drop off the ridge into drainages, so steep and overgrown that you can hike for 8 hours and not see a trail or a sign or any evidence that another human has been there in months. The park has over 200 square miles of wilderness, most of it invisible from the road, most of it unvisited, most of it holding the same old silence that it held before the Civilian Conservation Corps built the first trail and the first tourists drove their Model As up the mountain to admire the view. Dale Worthington had been with the Park Service for 12 years when I met him. He was a backcountry ranger, one of the handful of people whose job it was to patrol the remote sections of the park, checking trail conditions, monitoring wildlife, and maintaining the network of patrol cabins that the service kept in the deeper hollows for extended backcountry operations. Dale was in his early 40s, lean and quiet, the kind of man who spoke only when he had something worth saying and who carried himself with the particular calm of someone who'd spent so much time alone in the woods that solitude had become his natural state. He knew the park's backcountry better than anyone I'd ever met, better than the biologists and the trail crew chiefs and the old-timers who'd been working Shenandoah since the 70s. He'd spent months at a time in those hollows, living in patrol cabins that were little more than 4 walls and a wood stove, doing work that most rangers avoided because the isolation was too intense and the comfort too minimal. I liked Dale. Everyone did. In the reserved way you like someone you respect but don't fully know. He wasn't social, didn't come to the ranger gatherings at Big Meadows, and didn't linger at the district office when he came in for supplies. He'd resupply, file his reports, exchange a few words with whoever was around, and head back into the backcountry with the unhurried determination of a man returning to the place he belonged. In October of my second year, Dale was assigned to the Rapidan River Patrol Cabin for a 2-week rotation. The cabin sat at the upper reaches of the Rapidan, deep in a hollow on the east side of the Blue Ridge, accessible only by a 4-hour hike from the nearest trailhead. It was one of the more remote postings in the park, used primarily during fall and spring when the backcountry needed monitoring for poaching activity and trail damage. Dale had done this rotation many times. He knew the cabin, knew the hollow, knew the terrain the way he knew everything in the backcountry, with an intimacy that went beyond professional competence into something that resembled belonging. He hiked in on a Sunday afternoon. His first radio check-in was at 6 p.m. that evening, on schedule, reporting his arrival and initial observations. Weather clear, temperature 48 degrees, trail conditions good, no issues at the cabin. Standard report, standard delivery. Dale's voice flat and precise on the radio, the way it always was. He checked in again at 10 p.m., again at 2 a.m., again at 6 a.m. Monday. Each report on time, each report routine. Monday's evening and overnight check-ins were equally unremarkable. Weather observations, a bear sighting near the creek, a section of the trail that needed clearing. The mundane details of backcountry patrol were delivered with the meticulousness that defined Dale's approach to his work. His 6 a.m. check-in on Tuesday never came. Dispatch tried him at 6:15, no response. Again at 6:30, again at 6:45, 7, 7:15, 7:30, 7:45, 8, nothing. 8 attempts over 2 hours on a radio that Dale kept powered on and within arm's reach at all times, a radio he'd never failed to answer in 12 years of service. The dispatcher, a woman named Connie, who'd worked with Dale for most of those 12 years, told me later that by the 3rd missed call, she knew something was wrong. By the 5th, she was scared. By the 8th, she'd already contacted the district ranger, and a response team was being assembled. I was part of that team. 3 of us, myself, a senior ranger named Gary Estes, and a law enforcement ranger named Patricia Holbrook, who carried a sidearm and the particular alertness of someone trained to expect the worst. We left the trailhead at 9 a.m. and hiked the 4 hours to the Rapidan cabin at a pace that was closer to a jog than a walk, pushing through terrain that normally demanded careful footing, driven by the shared understanding that Dale Worthington didn't miss check-ins and that his silence meant something had happened that fell outside the normal range of backcountry incidents. We reached the cabin around 1 in the afternoon. It sat in a small clearing beside the creek, a simple log structure that had been built in the 1930s and maintained by the Park Service for patrol use. 1 room, 1 door, 2 windows, a wood stove, a plank floor. The kind of building that looks exactly like what it is, a shelter in the wilderness, minimal and functional, designed for the sole purpose of keeping a person alive and dry while they doed their work. The door was locked, not just closed but bolted. The heavy interior deadbolt that could only be engaged from inside the cabin was thrown into its housing with the solid authority of a lock that someone had deliberately secured. Gary knocked and called Dale's name and got no response. He tried the door, solid. I went to the windows, both latched from the inside, the simple hook-and-eye latches that the cabin used, both fastened tight. I pressed my face to the glass and looked in. The cabin was empty. I could see the cot against the far wall, made up neatly. The wood stove is cold. The table in the center of the room with Dale's radio sitting on it, the power light visible even through the dirty glass. His boots were beside the door, paired neatly. His pack is on a hook. His rain jacket is on another hook. Everything in its place, everything arranged with the precise orderliness that characterized Dale's approach to every aspect of his life. But no Dale. Patricia broke the window. She used the butt of her flashlight, punched out a pane, reached in and unlatched the hook, and climbed through. Gary and I followed. The cabin smelled like wood smoke and the faint mustiness of a structure that's closed up more than it's open. The floor was clean. The stove was cold but held relatively recent ash. Dale's gear was all there, all of it. Everything a person would need for a 2-week backcountry rotation, arranged with his characteristic neatness. His sleeping bag was on the cot, unrolled, the top folded back as if he'd gotten out of it and hadn't made it up yet. His food was in the bear box outside, which we checked properly stored, properly organized, showing the consumption pattern of 2 days of meals. His logbook was open on the table beside the radio. I picked it up and read the entries, looking for anything that would explain what had happened. Sunday's entry documented his arrival and setup. Monday's entries covered his patrol trail conditions, the bear sighting, weather observations, and the routine data of backcountry work. The final entry was dated Monday night, and it started normally. The handwriting steady and even, Dale's characteristically precise printing. 2,340 hours. Temperature 39 degrees Fahrenheit. Clear sky, wind calm. Heard movement outside the cabin at approximately 2,315. Initially assumed bear investigating exterior, have had bear activity near the creek this rotation. Movement continued. Circling pattern around cabin perimeter, consistent pace, approximately 1 circuit per 90 seconds. Observed from the window, unable to identify the source, not consistent with bear movement. Stride pattern suggests bipedal, not a person, no headlamp, no vocalization, no response to verbal challenge. Pace too regular, too mechanical for human gait. The handwriting changed after that. The letters got larger, less controlled, and the spacing irregular. The pen had pressed harder into the paper, leaving impressions that I could feel with my fingertip. Something has been circling the cabin since midnight. Not an animal, not a person. Keeping the door locked. Will report at morning check-in. That was it. The final words Dale Worthington committed to paper before he disappeared from a cabin that was locked from the inside with both windows latched and no exit that 3 experienced rangers could identify. We searched the cabin inch by inch. The floor was solid plank on joists, no trapdoor, no gaps large enough for a person to pass through. The walls were log, chinked and solid, no openings. The roof was intact, the ceiling boards tight. The chimney flue was 6 inches in diameter, barely large enough for a raccoon. The door had been bolted from the inside. The windows had been latched from the inside. Dale Worthington was a 6-foot, 180-pound man, and he had left a sealed room without breaking the seal. We searched the surrounding area for 3 days. Dog teams, helicopter support, 50 personnel at peak deployment. We found nothing. No tracks leading from the cabin, no gear in the woods, no clothing, no sign that Dale had ever left the building. The dogs picked up his scent at the cabin and nowhere else, as if he'd existed only within those 4 walls, and had simply ceased to exist when he stopped being inside them. The investigation that followed was thorough and inconclusive. The official report classified Dale as a missing person, status unknown. The theories ranged from voluntary disappearance to foul play to mental health crisis, none of them supported by evidence, all of them failing to address the fundamental impossibility of a man leaving a locked room without unlocking it. I finished my season and didn't come back for a 3rd summer. I told people I'd gotten a better offer, which was true in the sense that any offer that didn't involve the Rapidan River Hollow was better than returning to a park where a man I respected had vanished from inside a locked cabin after writing about something circling in the dark. I think about Dale's logbook entry more than I should. The precision of it, the observational detail that 12 years of training had made reflexive even under extreme stress. Circling pattern, 1 circuit per 90 seconds, not consistent with bear movement, bipedal. He documented what he was hearing with the same meticulous attention he brought to weather observations and trail conditions, recording the data even as the data was becoming terrifying, even as the thing circling his cabin was becoming something his experience couldn't categorize. And that final line, will report at morning check-in. The confidence of a professional who expected to survive the night, who expected the morning to come and the radio to work, and the report to be made and the situation to be resolved through the normal channels. Dale believed he'd be there for the 6 a.m. check-in. He believed the locked door would hold. He believed that whatever was outside would remain outside. He was wrong about at least one of those things, and I'll never know which one. By the time I reached the 100-mile wilderness, I'd been on the Appalachian Trail for 5 months and 17 days, and the person I'd been when I left Springer Mountain in Georgia in April bore only a passing resemblance to the person I was in late September, standing at the edge of the most remote section of trail in the eastern United States. 5 months of walking will do that. It strips away everything that isn't essential, every comfort and every pretension, and every fear that doesn't serve the basic project of putting one foot in front of the other from dawn until dark. I'd lost 30 pounds. I'd gained calluses on my feet so thick I could walk on gravel barefoot without feeling it. I'd developed the particular mental quietness of someone who spends their days in sustained physical effort and their nights in exhausted sleep, a quietness that left no room for anxiety or imagination, or the kinds of fears that plagued me in my previous life, my indoor life, the life I'd left behind in a cubicle in Hartford when I quit my job and drove to Georgia and started walking north. I wasn't afraid of the woods. That's not bravery, it's habituation. After 5 months of sleeping in shelters and tents in every condition the eastern wilderness could produce, the nighttime forest had become as familiar as a bedroom. I knew its sounds, the way a city person knows traffic sounds, the barred owls, the coyotes, the deer crashing through brush, the mice that ran across my sleeping bag in every shelter from Virginia to New Hampshire. I'd woken to bears sniffing my tent vestibule. I'd hiked through thunderstorms so violent the lightning turned night to strobing daylight. I'd navigated the whites in fog so thick I couldn't see my own feet. None of it scared me. Fear had been burned out of me by repetition, replaced by a calm watchfulness that served me well on the trail and that I'd come to think of as permanent. The 100-mile wilderness enters the Maine woods at Monson and doesn't come out until Able Bridge, 100 miles of trail through terrain that is genuinely remote in a way that most of the AT is not. No road crossings, no towns, no cell service, no easy evacuation if something goes wrong. The trail maintainers recommend carrying 10 days of food, and the warnings at the trailhead are explicit about the commitment you're making when you step past the sign. I'd planned carefully, packed sufficient food in a first aid kit, and was aware that for the next week, I was on my own in a way I hadn't been since the early days in Georgia. I entered the wilderness on a Monday morning in late September. The weather was cool and clear, the maples beginning to turn, the birches showing the first yellow that would become the full blaze of New England autumn within a few weeks. The trail was well marked and well maintained, and I made good time, covering 15 miles the first day and another 14 the second, settling into the rhythm of long-distance hiking that had become as natural as breathing. I saw a few other hikers heading south, section hikers mostly, and exchanged the brief friendly greetings that AT hikers share, but by the third day, I hadn't seen anyone for over 24 hours, and the solitude had deepened into something total, a complete separation from human society that I found not lonely but clarifying, the world reduced to trail and forest, and the simple imperative of forward motion. I camped on the third night at a designated site along the west branch of the Pleasant River. It was a good spot, flat ground with a fire ring and a log to sit on, and the river audible through the trees, the kind of campsite that felt welcoming after a long day. I set up my tent, cooked dinner, hung my bear bag, and settled in as the light faded and the forest transitioned from day to night with the gradual dimming that October produces in the northern woods, the shadows lengthening and deepening until they merged into a continuous darkness that the canopy made complete. I was in my sleeping bag, not yet asleep but approaching it, when I heard the footsteps. They came from the south, from the direction I'd hiked in from. The trail passed within 30 feet of my campsite, and the sound was on the trail, unmistakable, the particular crunch and compression of boots on packed earth that I'd been hearing and producing for 5 months. A steady walking pace, maybe 3 miles an hour, the unhurried stride of someone covering ground in the dark. My first thought was another through hiker, a night hiker pushing for miles in the cool air, which was common enough on the AT that it wouldn't have been remarkable. I expected to see the glow of a headlamp through the tent fabric, the warm circle of LED light that would announce a fellow hiker's presence. No light came. The footsteps continued, growing louder, closer, the sound sharpening as the distance decreased. I could hear individual steps now, the left-right cadence of a walking person, the slight variation in sound as each foot landed on a slightly different surface. Closer, 20 feet from my tent, maybe less, and then they stopped. The silence that followed was more disturbing than the sound. A hiker would have said something, would have seen my tent and called out, or would have passed by with the courtesy of someone who knows others are sleeping nearby. But nothing. No voice, no rustle of gear, no sound of a pack being lowered to the ground. Just absence, the sudden cessation of footsteps that had been clear and definite and purposeful, replaced by a silence that felt occupied, that had the quality of someone standing still, rather than no one being there. I called out, "Hello? Someone there?" My voice sounded wrong in the darkness, too loud, too human, an intrusion into a silence that didn't want to be broken. No response. I waited. 30 seconds. A minute. Nothing. I unzipped the tent. The zipper sound was enormous in the quiet, a ripping mechanical noise that I normally never thought about, but that now felt like an announcement, a declaration of my position and my vulnerability. I pulled back the flap and looked out. The trail was empty. I could see maybe 15 feet in either direction in the ambient darkness, the pale strip of packed earth visible between the dark walls of forest, and there was nobody on it. No person, no animal, no shape that could have produced the clear, distinct sound of booted feet walking at a steady pace and stopping 20 feet from where I lay. I got my headlamp and shone it down the trail in both directions. Empty. I checked the campsite perimeter, the beam cutting through the darkness and finding nothing but trees and brush and the normal nighttime forest that I'd been sleeping in for 5 months without fear. I stood there in my camp shoes and my sleep clothes, and I listened and heard only the river and the small sounds of the night, and nothing that resembled footsteps. I went back to bed. I told myself it was an animal, a deer walking the trail, the sound distorted by darkness, and the amplification of silence into something my brain had interpreted as human footsteps. This was reasonable. This was the kind of explanation that had served me well for 5 months of nighttime woods. I believed it was just enough to close my eyes. In the morning, I checked for tracks. The section of trail near my campsite was soft enough to hold impressions, a stretch of earth that showed my own boot prints clearly, the distinctive pattern of my trail runners arriving from the south the previous afternoon. I studied the ground carefully, looking for any other prints, any indication that feet other than mine had walked that trail. There was nothing. My prints are arriving, no other prints. No deer tracks, no moose tracks, no human boot impressions. The trail surface showed only my passage. I packed up and hiked. The day was normal, the trail was normal. My body performed its mechanical function of walking the way it had for 5 months, and by afternoon I'd almost convinced myself that the previous night had been a quirk of acoustics and imagination, one of those backcountry moments that seem significant in the dark and trivial in the light. I camped that night at a site near a pond, set up my tent, cooked dinner, and watched the stars appear through the canopy gaps above the water. Settled into my sleeping bag around 9, and at 11:47, the footsteps came again. From the south, same steady pace, same clear, distinct crunch of boots on trail, same approach, growing louder, growing closer, converging on my campsite with the unhurried determination of someone who knew exactly where I was and was walking directly to me. Same stop, 20 feet from my tent. Same silence, same occupied emptiness, the feeling of presence without evidence, of someone standing in the dark just beyond the range of sight. I didn't call out this time. I lay in my bag and listened to the silence and felt my heart beating and felt something that I hadn't felt in 5 months on the trail, something I thought the wilderness had burned out of me permanently. Fear, real fear, the kind that doesn't respond to rational explanation, the kind that comes from the animal part of the brain that knows things the conscious mind refuses to accept. The third night was the same. Different campsite, miles further north, and at some point after dark, the footsteps came from the south. Walking the trail I'd walked during the day, following my route with perfect fidelity, arriving at my camp, and stopping at that same distance, 20 feet, close enough to see me if there were eyes to see with, far enough to be outside the radius of any light I could produce. I started dreading the camps. I'd hike all day with the growing knowledge that when I stopped, when I set up my tent and crawled into my bag and let the darkness settle around me, the footsteps would come. They became the defining feature of my final days on the trail, the thing I organized my thoughts around, the question I couldn't answer and couldn't stop asking. Who was following me? What was following me? Why did it stop at 20 feet? What was the significance of that distance, that boundary that it maintained every night with the precision of something measuring? The fourth night, my last night before Katahdin Stream Campground, I did something I'm not proud of and was not sure was wise. When the footsteps stopped, when the silence settled into that occupied pause, I turned on my headlamp and pointed it at the trail, and I looked. There was nothing there. The beam showed me empty trail, undisturbed forest, the normal architecture of a Maine woodland at night, but the light also showed me something on the ground. Not a print exactly, but a disturbance. The leaf litter on the trail surface was pressed down in a pattern that might have been a footprint and might have been nothing, a vague impression that was almost too faint to see, but that was exactly 20 feet from my tent door, exactly where the footsteps had stopped. I reached Katahdin Stream the next day, summited Katahdin the morning after that, finished the trail, and went home. I did all the things that thru hikers do when they return to the world, readjusted, reconnected, told stories about the trail that people listened to with varying degrees of interest. I told the funny stories, the beautiful stories, and the hard stories. I never told this one, because this one doesn't have a shape that stories are supposed to have. It doesn't build to a climax or resolve into understanding. It's just a thing that happened, a sound that repeated for 4 nights in the most remote section of the most remote trail in the eastern United States, a presence that followed me through the 100-mile wilderness and stopped every night at a distance that felt deliberate and maintained a silence that felt chosen. I don't know what it was. I don't know why it stopped at 20 feet. I don't know why it never approached closer, never announced itself, never made any sound except the footsteps that brought it to my camp and the silence that held it there until morning. But I know this. Something walked behind me through the 100-mile wilderness. Something that left no tracks and cast no light and answered no greeting and kept a distance that it never varied, following me through the most remote section of my most remote journey with the patience of something that had been walking those woods for a very long time and would continue walking them long after I was gone. And sometimes, on quiet nights, in the house I live in now with its solid walls and its locks and its distance from any forest, I hear footsteps, not outside, not on the stairs, in my memory. The clear, distinct crunch of boots on packed earth, approaching from the south, growing louder, growing closer, stopping at a distance that I measure without thinking. 20 feet, always 20 feet. The boundary line of something that followed me out of the woods in a way that no lock can secure against and no distance can resolve. My brother Kevin and I started going to the boundary waters when I was 16 and he was 14, dragged there by our father, who believed that a week in a canoe with no electronics and no running water was the best possible thing for 2 teenage boys who were otherwise destined to spend their summers staring at screens. He was right, though I wouldn't have admitted it at the time. The boundary waters got into us the way certain places do, not through a single dramatic experience, but through accumulation, through years of paddling and portaging and sleeping on granite points under skies so full of stars, they looked fabricated. By the time we were adults, we'd taken over the tradition from our father, who'd gotten too old for the portages, and every August we'd load the canoe and drive north from Minneapolis and spend a week in the wilderness doing nothing that mattered and everything that counted. The lake I'm talking about doesn't have a name I'm going to share. That's not because I'm worried about people going there. It's a difficult access point requiring multiple portages through rough terrain, and the kind of person who'd attempt it is the kind of person who's already been to 100 lakes like it. I'm not sharing the name because naming it makes it more real, more specific, more connected to the geography of a place I still visit, and I need some distance between what happened there and the reality I operate in the rest of the year. We'd been to this lake 3 or 4 times before. It was one of our regular destinations, a small body of water, maybe half a mile long and a quarter mile wide, deep enough that the water was dark, even in the shallows, ringed by boreal forest that came right to the water's edge in most places. The shoreline was mostly granite, the Canadian shield rock that defines the Boundary Waters landscape, with a few sand beaches where creeks entered. There was one designated campsite on a granite point on the northern shore, a beautiful spot with a flat area for tents and a fire grate, and the kind of sunset view that makes you understand why people become addicted to this place. We knew the lake well. We'd fished it, swum in it, watched storms roll across it, sat on that granite point, and watched loons dive and northern lights shimmer above the tree line. It was familiar to us in the way only a place visited repeatedly over many years can be familiar. We arrived mid-afternoon on a Tuesday in August of 2021. The portage had been brutal, the trail steep and muddy from recent rain, and we were sweating and tired, and glad to see the lake open up through the trees at the end of the trail. We made camp on the granite point, set up the tent, filtered water, and ate a late lunch. By 3 o'clock, the camp was established, and the afternoon stretched ahead of us with nothing to fill it except what the lake offered, which was fishing. We loaded the tackle into the canoe and pushed off from the point and paddled toward the southern shore, where we'd had luck with smallmouth bass on previous trips. Kevin noticed it first. We were maybe 100 yards from the southern shore, drifting in the canoe, lines in the water, when he said something that I initially dismissed as a joke. He said the trees looked different down there. I assumed he meant the trees on the shore had changed since our last visit, maybe a blowdown or some disease damage, and I looked up from my rod to check. The trees on the shore looked normal. Spruce, birch, and jack pine are the standard boreal mix that surrounds every lake in the Boundary Waters. I told him they looked fine and went back to fishing. He said no, not the shore. Down there, in the water. I looked at the lake's surface. The water was calm, nearly glassy, the kind of perfect stillness that the Boundary Waters produces on windless August afternoons when the air is warm and heavy, and the lake becomes a mirror. I could see the reflection of the southern shore clearly, the tree line inverted on the water's surface in the way that every still lake reflects its surroundings. And Kevin was right. Something was wrong. I stared at the reflection for a long time, trying to identify what was off, because the wrongness wasn't obvious. It wasn't like looking at a distortion or an aberration. It was subtler than that, more fundamental, the kind of discrepancy that registers as unease before it registers as observation. The reflected tree line was different from the actual tree line. Not drastically, not cartoonishly, but definitely, persistently different. The trees in the reflection were not boreal. They were hardwoods, broad-leafed, dense, the kind of forest you'd see in the Appalachians or the Ozarks, not in northern Minnesota. The shapes were wrong. The spacing was wrong. The color was wrong, darker, a deeper green that suggested a canopy heavier and more closed than anything the boreal forest produces. I looked from the shore to the reflection and back, comparing them directly, my eyes tracking from reality to mirror image and finding the two irreconcilable. The shore showed spruce and birch, open and light, the characteristic boreal forest of the North Woods. The reflection showed something else entirely, a forest of oak and maple, and something darker growing between them. Trees so close together their canopies merged into a continuous mass that allowed no light through. And the shoreline was different. The actual shore had a granite shelf that extended into the water at a gentle angle, with a few boulders breaking the surface near the bank. The reflected shoreline was different in shape, the bays and points not matching, the rocks in different positions. The entire geography of the lake's edge altered as if the water were reflecting a different shore, a shore that belonged to a different lake in a different place. Kevin pointed at the sky. I looked up, clear August blue with a few scattered cumulus clouds, the kind of perfect summer sky that makes you want to lie in the bottom of a canoe and stare upward for hours. I looked at the sky's reflection in the water. Gray. Flat, uniform gray, the overcast of a day in late October or November, the sky of a place where the sun hadn't broken through in a long time. The reflected clouds were different from the actual clouds. The reflected light was different, colder, the flat illumination of an overcast day, casting no shadows and creating no warmth. We were sitting in a canoe on a lake that was reflecting a different place. I put my hand in the water. It was warm, the normal August temperature of a Minnesota lake that had been absorbing solar energy all summer. But when I looked at my hand beneath the surface, the water seemed deeper than it should have been, the visibility less, as if the water itself was thicker or darker than what my hand was actually immersed in. I pulled my hand out, and it was just wet, just normal lake water, but the surface where my hand had broken through was slow to settle, the ripples moving outward with a heaviness that suggested a density the water shouldn't have had. Kevin wanted to paddle closer to the southern shore, to see if the reflection resolved itself as the angle changed. I said no. I said it with a firmness that surprised both of us. A refusal that came from somewhere below conscious decision, from a part of my brain that had assessed the situation and concluded that getting closer to whatever was being reflected in that water was something we should not do. Kevin looked at me, and I think he saw something in my face that made arguing pointless, because he picked up his paddle without a word and we turned the canoe and went back to camp. We didn't go back on the water that afternoon. We sat on the granite point and watched the lake from shore, and from that angle, at that distance, the reflection looked normal. The trees in the water matched the trees on the shore. The sky in the water matched the sky above. Whatever discrepancy we'd seen from the canoe was either gone or invisible from this perspective, and the temptation to dismiss it as a trick of light or angle was strong enough that we almost talked ourselves into believing it, but I kept watching. As the afternoon wore on and the sun moved west and the light changed, I noticed moments when the reflection flickered, not continuously wrong, but intermittently, like a signal going in and out. For a few seconds, the reflected tree line would shift, the hardwoods replacing the boreal forest, the gray sky replacing the blue, and then it would snap back to normal, the lake showing exactly what it should, as if the connection to whatever other place the reflection was accessing had momentarily strengthened and then weakened again. By evening, the flickering had stopped. The sunset reflected perfectly in the water. The colors matched, the trees matched, and the sky matched. Kevin and I ate dinner and sat by the fire and talked about everything except what we'd seen, because talking about it would have required deciding what it meant, and neither of us was ready for that conversation. We slept, or Kevin slept. I lay in the tent and listened to the lake and thought about reflections and what they actually are, which is light bouncing off a surface, which is physics, which is measurable and predictable, and doesn't allow for a lake in Minnesota to reflect a forest in some other place, under some other sky on some other day. And yet, in the morning, the lake was normal. We went out in the canoe, and the reflection was perfect. Every tree matched, every cloud matched, the water showing us exactly what was above and around it, with the faithful accuracy that physics demands. We fished, we caught bass, we paddled the entire shoreline, and the reflection tracked reality with no discrepancy, no flicker, no moment of wrongness. We paddled home the next day. We've been back to the boundary waters every summer since, but we haven't gone back to that lake. We go to other lakes, other portage routes, other campsites on other granite points, where the water shows us what the water should show us, and nothing else. Kevin and I have talked about it twice. Both times the conversation was short. The first time, he asked me what I thought we saw. I said I didn't know. The second time, months later, he said something that I've thought about more than anything else associated with that day. He said he thought the lake wasn't reflecting a different place. He thought it was reflecting the same place at a different time. That the hardwood forest and the gray sky and the different shoreline were what that place looked like before the boreal forest grew, or what it would look like after, or what it looked like in some other version of the same geography. A version where the glaciers carved differently, or the climate shifted differently, or the world took a different path to the present. I don't know if he's right. I don't know if anyone could be right about something like this, because the categories we use to understand the world don't include lakes that reflect alternate landscapes for 6 hours on an August afternoon. But I think about it. I think about what was down there, beneath the surface, in the depth that seemed deeper than depth, and the darkness that seemed darker than water. I think about the heaviness of the ripples when I put my hand in, the slow density that suggested the water was more than water, that it was a medium between two versions of the same place, and that on certain days, under certain conditions, the barrier thinned enough to see through. And I'm glad I didn't let us paddle closer. I'm glad we stayed on our side of whatever boundary that lake represents. Because I think if we'd gotten close enough, if we'd looked straight down into that water at the right moment, we would have seen not just a different forest and a different sky, but a different lake, looking back up at us from below, reflecting us into a place we couldn't return from. And I think somewhere, in that gray-skied hardwood version of the same coordinates, there's a granite point with a campsite where two brothers never arrived, where the canoe never landed, where the tent was never pitched, and the lake waits, still and patient, for someone to look down into it from the right angle at the right time and see what's on the other side. Trail registers are one of those things that non-hikers don't think about, and thru-hikers think about constantly. They're simple objects, just spiral-bound notebooks and Ziploc bags, placed in the wooden boxes or on the shelves of the three-sided lean-to shelters that the trail-maintaining clubs have built and rebuilt along the Appalachian Trail for the better part of a century. The concept is basic. You arrive at a shelter, you sign in with your trail name and the date and maybe a note about the weather or the trail conditions or whatever is on your mind, and you move on. The next person does the same. Over the course of a season, the register fills with a running chronicle of passage, a collective document written by hundreds of hands that captures the culture of the trail in a way that no guidebook or blog post ever could. There are jokes and complaints and philosophical observations and drawings of varying quality, and the occasional heartfelt confession, the kind of thing a person writes when they've been walking alone for days, and the notebook is the only audience available. I've read thousands of register entries over the years. Most are forgettable, some are funny, a handful are beautiful, and one, in a shelter in the Jefferson National Forest in Virginia, is the reason I don't sleep in shelters anymore. I'm a section hiker, which means I tackle the AT in pieces, a few days at a time, stitching together the trail over years rather than attempting the whole thing in a single 6-month push. I'd been working on the Virginia section for 3 years by the summer of 2022, picking off segments when work allowed, and in June I had a 4-day window that I planned to use on a stretch south of McAfee Knob, a section I'd hiked twice before and knew well enough to move through efficiently. The terrain was moderate, the shelters were well spaced for my daily mileage, and the forecast was good. It was supposed to be a routine trip, the kind of pleasant and unremarkable hike that fills the spaces between the memorable ones. The shelter I stopped at on the second afternoon was one I'd used before, a standard AT lean-to built sometime in the 80s, with a wooden sleeping platform that held maybe 6 people, a fire ring out front, a privy down a side trail, and the usual complement of mouse-chewed gear and forgotten socks that accumulates in shelters used by thousands of hikers a year. It sat in a small clearing about 100 yards from a creek, surrounded by mixed hardwood forest, the kind of spot that was pleasant without being remarkable, functional without being memorable. I'd slept there twice on previous section hikes, and had no strong feelings about the place one way or the other. I arrived around 4 in the afternoon, early enough to have the luxury of an unhurried evening. The shelter was empty, no gear on the platform, no hikers in the area. I dropped my pack and set up my sleeping pad and bag on the platform and did the usual camp routine: filtered water from the creek, hung my food bag, and changed out of my hiking clothes. Then I sat on the platform with my feet hanging over the edge and picked up the register. The register was a standard composition notebook, the black and white marbled kind, protected by a gallon Ziploc bag. It was maybe half full, the entries starting from early April, the beginning of the northbound through hiking season. I flipped to the most recent page and signed in, noting the date, my trail name, and a brief comment about the weather. Then I flipped back, casually, the way I always did, browsing the entries from recent weeks, reading the notes left by hikers who'd passed through before me. The entries were normal at first. Trail names I didn't recognize, dates from May and early June, the usual mix of mileage notes and weather observations and complaints about rocks and celebrations of good water sources. Someone had drawn a passable sketch of the shelter. Someone else had written a limerick that was crude but genuinely funny. The register read like every other register I'd ever picked up, a document of ordinary people doing an extraordinary thing one step at a time. Then I turned a page, and the entries changed. The handwriting was different from everything that came before it. Neat, controlled, slightly small. The writing of someone who was educated and deliberate about how they formed their letters. The first entry was dated May 23rd. It read in its entirety, "He is still in the corner. Do not look at the corner. If you look, he knows you can see him. Do not look at the corner." I read it twice, the way you read anything unexpected, your brain running the words through a second time to confirm that you understood them correctly. I assumed it was a joke, the kind of creepy entry that hikers sometimes leave in registers to mess with the people who come after them. I'd seen entries about ghosts and Bigfoot and the Blair Witch and a dozen other horror tropes deployed for entertainment in the pages of trail registers. This was just another one. I turned the page. The same entry, same handwriting, same words, same measured precision. "He is still in the corner. Do not look at the corner. If you look, he knows you can see him. Do not look at the corner." Dated May 24th. I turned another page. Same entry, May 25th. Same words, same hand, filling the page from top to bottom in neat rows. The sentences packed tight as if the writer wanted to fit as many repetitions as possible on each page. I counted 17 repetitions of the same message on a single page, written with a consistency that showed no variation in pressure, spacing, or letter formation. I started flipping faster. May 26th, same. May 27th, same. May 28th, 29th, 30th, 31st, June 1st, 2nd. Page after page after page of the same sentence, the same handwriting, the same warning repeated with a regularity that went beyond obsession into something clinical, something that suggested not a person trying to scare future readers, but a person documenting an ongoing observation with the meticulous consistency of a scientist recording data. The handwriting never changed. It didn't deteriorate, didn't get larger or more frantic, didn't show the tremor or the inconsistency that you'd expect from someone in psychological distress. It was steady from first page to last, the writing of someone who was calm, who was certain of what they were seeing, who sat in this shelter for 11 consecutive days and filled 15 pages of a notebook with a warning about something in the corner. 11 days. I checked the dates 3 times to be sure. May 23rd through June 2nd. 11 days of entries, multiple pages per day, the same message repeated hundreds of times. Who sits in a trail shelter for 11 days? Through hikers stay one night and move on. Even injured hikers get evacuated within a day or two. 11 days in a shelter is not hiking behavior. 11 days is living there for 11 days. 11 days is choosing to remain in a 3-sided wooden structure in the forest and spending your time writing the same sentence over and over in a notebook that you know other people will read. I looked at the corner. I couldn't stop myself. The warning was so specific, so insistent, so precisely targeted at a single location in the shelter that my eyes went there before my conscious mind could intervene. The back left corner, where the 2 side walls met at a 90-degree angle, the joint darkened by decades of weathering and staining, the wood rough-hewn and splintered with age. Shadow collected there naturally, the overhang of the roof creating a pocket of darkness that the afternoon light didn't reach. There was nothing there. Wood and shadow, and the faint smell of old timber, and the accumulated must of a structure that had been standing in the Virginia mountains for 40 years. Nothing. I looked away and felt relief, and then felt something else, something that operated beneath relief, a persistent low-frequency unease that the absence of evidence didn't resolve. Because 15 pages of identical handwriting is its own kind of evidence. Because 11 days of repetition is its own kind of proof. And because the person who wrote those pages was not, based on the steadiness of their hand and the consistency of their message, experiencing a hallucination or a breakdown. They were documenting what they saw with the calm precision of someone who trusted their own eyes. I put the register down. I looked at the corner again, involuntarily. The way your tongue goes to a loose tooth. Shadow, wood, nothing that I could see. Nothing that justified the feeling that was building in my chest, the creeping sense that the absence of something visible was not the same as the absence of something present. I packed up. I put my sleeping bag back in my pack and laced my boots and left the shelter. It was past 5 and the light was starting to soften with the approach of evening, and I had maybe 2 hours of usable daylight left, enough to put a couple of miles between me and that shelter if I moved fast. I hiked until the light was nearly gone and then pitched my tent on a flat spot beside the trail, a spot with no shelter and no corner and no shadow that could hold something I didn't want to see. I lay in my tent that night and I thought about the person who wrote those entries. I thought about them sitting on the platform in that shelter, notebook in their lap, pen moving steadily across the page, writing their warning over and over while something occupied the back left corner, something that the writer could see and that the writer believed would become aware of being seen if anyone else looked directly at it. I thought about the 11 days, the meals eaten in that shelter, the water fetched from that creek, the nights spent sleeping 6 feet from a corner that held something the writer couldn't look away from and couldn't stop documenting. I thought about what it must have been like on the first day, to arrive at a shelter, a normal shelter on a normal hike, and to look at the corner and see something there that shouldn't be there. To write it down, the first time, as an observation, maybe even with the expectation that it would be gone in the morning, and then the second day, to find it still there, and the third, and the fourth, to watch it persist, to confirm its presence day after day, to fill page after page with the same message because the message was the only response available, the only action that could be taken against something that had no explanation and no solution. I went back to the shelter 3 months later. I went in daylight, deliberately, with the intention of checking the register and seeing if anyone else had written about the corner. The register was gone, replaced with a new one, a fresh notebook with entries starting in mid-July. The old register, with its 15 pages of repeated warnings, had been removed. I asked at the next shelter if anyone knew what had happened to it. A thru-hiker told me that trail maintenance clubs sometimes replace registers that are full or damaged, and that the old ones are archived. He didn't know anything about the contents. I never found out who wrote those entries. I never found out if anyone else saw what they saw, and I never found out what was in the corner. But I don't sleep in shelters anymore. I carry a tent and I pitch it on open ground, and I sleep in my own space with walls that I control and corners that I can see. All of them, from every angle, in whatever light is available. And sometimes, in the darkest hour, when the tent fabric is just a thin membrane between me and the forest, and the shadows gather in the folds of the material, I think about that shelter and that corner and that person sitting there for 11 days with their notebook, calm and steady, writing their warning for the next person who'd sit on that platform and pick up the register and read the words and do exactly what I did. Look at the corner. I looked, and I saw nothing, and I left, and I'm fine. But I don't know what the person who wrote those pages saw. I don't know what they were looking at for 11 days. And I don't know if seeing nothing means there's nothing there, or if it means I'm one of the lucky ones who can't see what occupies the dark places where the walls meet, the corners where the shadows collect and hold their shape even when the light changes, the spaces in old structures that something has claimed and that something inhabits with a patience that outlasts wood and weather, and the temporary curiosity of hikers who read warnings and test them and walk away. Some of us walk away, some of us stay for 11 days. And the difference between those two outcomes might just be what you see when you look at the corner, or what sees you looking back. I wasn't part of the official search for Marcus Webb. I need to be clear about that up front, because the details I'm about to share came to me through channels that weren't entirely official, and the people who passed them along did so with the understanding that I wouldn't attach their names to the information. I was a seasonal trail crew member at Appalachian National Park in 2019, the kind of low-level position that puts you close to the operations of the park without giving you any authority or access to the sensitive side of things. But seasonal crews talk to rangers, and rangers talk to each other, and in a park as remote and tightly staffed as Olympic, information moves through the system the way water moves through moss, slowly but thoroughly, saturating everything it touches. By the time the search for Marcus Webb was in its third day, everyone in the park knew the broad outline. By the time it was over, a few of us knew details that never appeared in any public report, and that I've spent 5 years trying to find a rational framework for and failing. Marcus Webb was 36 years old, a landscape photographer from Portland who'd been coming to Olympic for years. His work was exceptional, the kind of photography that made you see familiar places in unfamiliar ways, and the Hoh rainforest was one of his primary subjects. He'd published 2 books of Olympic photographs and had a following among the nature photography community that was significant enough to generate real concern when he didn't return from his November trip. He was experienced in the backcountry, physically fit, well-equipped, and familiar with the terrain. He was not the kind of person who gets lost in the woods. He entered the Hoh River Trail on a Monday morning, signed the backcountry register, and hiked 12 miles into the interior to a campsite on a gravel bar along the river. 12 miles in the Hoh is deep. The trailhead itself is at the end of a road that most tourists don't drive, and the further you go up the valley, the more the rainforest closes in, the canopy drops lower, the moss grows thicker, the light filters through so many layers of green that the forest floor exists in a permanent aquatic twilight. At 12 miles, you're in the heart of it, surrounded by old-growth Sitka spruce and western red cedar and big-leaf maple, so heavily draped in moss they look like they're wearing coats, and the silence is so deep, and the green is so total, that the human world feels not just far away but theoretical, a concept you remember but can't quite verify. The search started on Saturday when he was a day overdue. Rangers hiked the trail and found his campsite on the gravel bar that afternoon. Everything was there. The tent was pitched properly on the gravel, staked and guyed despite the river rocks, making it difficult. Inside, his sleeping bag was laid out on a pad, his pack was organized against the wall, his cook kit was clean and stored, his food bag was properly hung from a bare wire between 2 trees. His boots were inside the tent vestibule. His rain jacket was draped over the pack. Everything accounted for, everything in its place, everything suggesting a person who had set up camp methodically and then stepped away and not returned. The only things missing were Marcus himself, the clothes he'd presumably been wearing, and his camera. They found the camera a quarter mile upstream from camp, on the opposite side of the river. It was sitting on a moss-covered log, upright, lens facing forward, as if someone had placed it there with care, positioned it deliberately in a spot where it would be found, not dropped, not discarded, not lost in a fall or a scramble, placed the way you'd place a camera on a tripod, with attention to its angle and its stability, ensuring it would remain where it was put. The camera was a professional DSLR, weather-sealed, expensive, the kind of equipment a photographer like Marcus would have carried as an extension of his body. It was undamaged. The battery still had charge. The memory card was intact, containing 347 photographs. I saw copies of those photographs. I'm not going to tell you how. A person who was involved in the search shared them with me months later, in a context that I won't describe, and I sat in my apartment in Port Angeles and scrolled through them on a laptop screen, and what I saw has stayed with me in a way that I can't shake and don't expect to ever fully process. The first 340 photographs were what you'd expect from Marcus Webb in the Hoh Rainforest in November. They were stunning. The green light filtering through the canopy, the Hoh River running silver over gravel bars, the massive trunks of ancient spruce disappearing into moss-shrouded canopy, the particular quality of rain in the rainforest, where every surface is already so saturated that new water seems to hang in the air rather than fall. He'd been working. He'd been doing what he came to do, photographing the forest with the skill and attention that had made his reputation. The metadata on the images showed they'd been taken over 3 days, Monday through Wednesday, during daylight hours, with the careful spacing that suggested a photographer moving slowly through the landscape, waiting for light, composing deliberately. The last 7 photographs were different. They were taken on Thursday night, his 4th night in the backcountry, the night before the rangers would have expected him to begin his hike out. The timestamp started at 2 a.m. and ended at 2:17 a.m. 17 minutes, 7 frames. All 7 photographs showed the same subject. Marcus's campsite, photographed from approximately 50 yards away, from the opposite bank of the Hoh River. The perspective was looking across the water at the gravel bar where his tent was pitched, the small orange dome visible against the gray river rocks, the dark wall of rainforest rising behind it. The images were taken without a flash, using a long exposure that captured the ambient light of a forest night, which in the Hoh in November is almost no light at all. The photographs were dark, grainy, the kind of images that emerge from pushing a camera's sensor to its limits, pulling detail from near total darkness. In the first photograph, timestamp 2 a.m., the campsite looked normal. Tent on the gravel, forest behind it, the river a dark stripe between the camera and the camp. The exposure was long enough to show detail in the shadows, the individual trunks of the spruce trees behind the tent, the texture of the gravel, the shape of the bare wire between the food-hang trees. A nighttime photograph of an empty campsite, technically challenging, artistically unremarkable. The search team looked at all 7 photographs and noted that something changed between frames, but couldn't initially identify what. The images were dark and grainy, and the differences were subtle. It was a forensic analyst in the Park Service's investigative unit who finally isolated it. In the background of the first photograph, behind the tent, at the tree line where the gravel bar met the forest, there was a dark shape, partially obscured by a spruce trunk, barely distinguishable from the shadows around it. It registered as a slightly denser patch of darkness at the edge of the frame. The analyst almost missed it. It was only by comparing the first frame to the last frame, by toggling between the 2 images rapidly on a high-resolution monitor, that the difference became apparent. The shape moved between frames. In each successive photograph, taken at intervals of roughly 2.5 minutes, the dark shape was in a different position. It had emerged from behind the spruce trunk in frame 2. By frame 3, it had moved to the edge of the gravel bar. Frame 4 showed it among the river rocks, closer to the tent. Frame 5, closer still. Frame 6, maybe 10 yards from the tent. Frame 7, the final image, timestamp 2:17 a.m., showed the shape approximately 5 yards from the tent's entrance, a dark mass that was tall and narrow, and that did not reflect light the way any natural object in that environment should have. 30 yards of movement in 17 minutes. 7 frames documenting something approaching a sleeping man's tent in the deep backcountry of the Hoh Rainforest at 2 in the morning, captured by a camera that was positioned across the river on a moss-covered log, aimed at the campsite with the deliberate precision of a photographer who knew exactly what he wanted to document. That's what I can't get past. Marcus set up the shot. He waded across the Ho River in the middle of the night in November, when the water temperature would have been in the low 40s, and he placed his camera on a log, and he aimed it at his own campsite, and he set it to take photographs at intervals. He was documenting something he'd seen before, something he knew would come back, something he'd observed on previous nights, and had decided to capture on camera with the professional discipline that defined his approach to photography. He knew it was coming. He'd seen it before, probably on nights 2 and 3, and instead of hiking out at first light, he'd stayed. He'd stayed because he was a photographer, and this was the photograph, the image that no one else had captured, the thing in the Ho rainforest that moved through the darkness and approached sleeping campers with a patience that covered 30 yards in 17 minutes. The search lasted 9 days. 60 personnel, dog teams, and helicopter support. They found nothing else. No clothing, no tracks, no remains. No sign that Marcus Webb had left that gravel bar by any direction in any manner. The Ho River was searched downstream for miles. The forest on both sides was gridded and walked. Nothing. His family held a memorial in Portland the following spring. His books went out of print and then back into print when the story of his disappearance generated renewed interest in his work. The photography community mourned him as an artist. The outdoor community discussed him as a cautionary tale. Neither community saw the final 7 photographs, which were entered into evidence in the missing persons investigation and have not been publicly released. I saw them. I sat in my apartment and I looked at 7 images of a campsite in the Ho rainforest, and I watched something dark emerge from the tree line and cross 30 yards of gravel in 17 minutes toward a tent where a man was either sleeping or pretending to sleep while his camera documented what was coming for him from across the river. And the thing that stays with me, the detail that I return to when I'm lying in bed at night listening to rain on the roof of my house in Port Angeles, which is not that far from the Ho, which is not that far from the gravel bar where Marcus Webb pitched his tent for the last time, is this. He placed the camera. He crossed the river in the dark and the cold, and he placed his camera on a log, and he aimed it at his own camp, and he went back to his tent, and he waited. He waited for the thing he'd seen on previous nights to come back, and he let his camera see what it would see, and in the morning he was supposed to cross the river and retrieve the camera and look at the images and have proof. But morning didn't come for Marcus Webb. Something came instead, at 2 a.m., from the tree line, crossing the gravel with a patience that 7 frames of evidence documented in grainy, dark, irrefutable detail. And the camera sat on its log, pointing at nothing, its memory card holding 7 photographs that nobody was supposed to see, except the man who'd set the shot and who trusted that the river between him and the camera was distance enough to keep him safe, while the shutter clicked and the thing got closer and the 17 minutes ran out. He was wrong about the river. He was wrong about the distance. And the camera that was supposed to be his proof became instead the only witness to whatever happened on that gravel bar after 2:17 a.m. on a November night in the deepest, greenest, quietest place in the Pacific Northwest. Marcus Webb's camera is in an evidence locker somewhere. His photographs are in a file. And whatever walked across that gravel bar is still in the Ho, still in the old growth, still moving through the moss and the green twilight, with the patience of something that has all the time in the world and no reason to hurry. Because it knows what the photographer knew. It knows that people come to the Ho alone. It knows they pitch their tents on gravel bars and sleep in the deep silence of the rainforest, and believe that the river and the trees and the darkness are just scenery. And it knows that some of them don't come back. And the forest closes over the space where they were. The moss grows over the gravel. The rain washes the river clean. And the Ho keeps its secrets the way it's always kept them, in the green dark, in the deep interior, in the place where the canopy blocks the sky and the silence is total, and the cameras, if anyone thinks to point them at the right place at the right time, capture things that the morning light erases but the memory card preserves. 7 frames, 17 minutes, 30 yards of darkness, getting closer, and then nothing. Yosemite in October is a different park than the one most people know. The summer version, the one that draws 4 million visitors a year and packs the valley floor with cars and fills every trail with a steady stream of hikers, gives way in autumn to something quieter and older, a version of the park that remembers what it was before the roads and the hotels and the shuttle buses. The waterfalls are diminished, running on the dregs of the previous winter's snowpack, their spring thunder reduced to a steady murmur, that you can hear only when you're close. The meadows are brown, the deciduous trees are turning, the black oaks and maples producing patches of gold and amber against the granite and the dark green of the conifers. The crowds thin to almost nothing on weekdays, and if you time it right, you can hike trails that carry hundreds of people per hour in July in something approaching genuine solitude. That's why I go in October. I've been visiting the park for 15 years, and I learned early that the Yosemite I loved was the empty one, the quiet one, the version that existed in the spaces between the crowds. I'd driven up from Fresno on a Wednesday morning, arriving at the park before 7. The valley was still in shadow, the granite walls holding the early light on their upper faces, while the floor remained in a blue-gray twilight that would persist until the sun climbed high enough to clear the rim. I parked at the Happy Isles trailhead and started up the mist trail toward Vernal Fall around 8, carrying a day pack with water and lunch and a jacket for the spray. The trail was empty. I saw 2 hikers descending as I climbed, a couple with trekking poles who nodded and passed without conversation, and after that I was alone. The Mist Trail is one of the most popular hikes in Yosemite, a steep climb along the Merced River that takes you past Vernal Fall and Nevada Fall, 2 of the park's iconic waterfalls. In summer, the trail is a highway, crowded enough that you sometimes have to wait in line at the narrow sections. In October, it's a different experience entirely. The river runs lower. The spray that gives the trail its name is reduced to a fine mist, and the granite steps that were slick and treacherous in the spring runoff are dry enough to climb without fear. The forest along the lower section is dense. Douglas fir and incense cedar and canyon live oak, the trees big enough to block the sky in places and old enough to predate the park by centuries. I reached the base of Vernal Fall around 10. The fall was running at maybe a quarter of its spring volume, but even diminished, it was impressive. A wide curtain of water dropping 317 feet from the lip of the granite step to the pool below. The mist was light, a fine spray that drifted in the slight morning breeze, and the roar of the water was present but not overwhelming, a sustained sound that filled the canyon without dominating it, leaving room for bird calls and the rustle of wind in the trees and the smaller sounds of the river below the fall. I found a flat rock near the base of the fall, maybe 30 yards from the pool, where the water crashed into the river, and I sat down to eat lunch. The rock was dry and warm from the morning sun, and I settled in with my sandwich and my water bottle and the comfortable solitude of a place I knew well. I'd been to Vernal Fall a dozen times over the years. I knew its moods, the way it changed with the seasons and the snow levels, the difference between the thundering spring cascade and the gentler autumn flow. I knew its sound. Every waterfall has an acoustic signature, a specific mix of frequencies produced by the volume and velocity and angle of the water and the shape of the rock it strikes. Vernal Fall's signature was a deep, sustained roar with higher overtones from the spray impact, a sound that was complex but consistent, a white noise that your brain processed as continuous and uniform. The sound I was hearing was not uniform. I noticed it gradually, the way you notice a wrong note in a familiar song, not as a sudden disruption but as a growing awareness that something in the pattern had shifted. There was something in the sound of the fall that didn't belong. Beneath the roar, threaded through it the way a single instrument threads through an orchestra, there was a vocalization, a human-like sound, sustained, rising and falling with the rhythm of the water, a voice that was using the cascade as a carrier wave, embedding itself in the white noise the way a signal embeds in static. I stopped eating and listened. The vocalization was faint but persistent, a pitch that hovered in the range of a human voice, somewhere between a low moan and a sustained call. It wasn't words, it wasn't singing, it was something between the two, a sound that had the tonal quality of language without resolving into any language I recognized. It rose and fell, modulating with the water's rhythm, and the more I listened, the more defined it became, as if my attention were tuning it in, pulling the signal from the noise, clarifying a voice that had been there all along, but that I'd been filtering out as part of the waterfall's natural acoustics. I told myself it was pareidolia. The human brain is wired to find patterns, to extract meaningful signals from random noise, and waterfalls are natural white noise generators. People hear voices in waterfalls, the way they see faces in rock formations. It's a product of cognitive wiring, not reality. I knew this. I'd read about it. I believed it in the rational, well-lit part of my mind that processes information and draws conclusions based on evidence. But I moved closer to the fall. I didn't decide to move closer. My body moved, drawn by the sound the way your hand moves toward a ringing phone, reflexively, before the conscious mind has weighed in on whether answering is a good idea. I left my rock and my sandwich and walked toward the pool at the base of the fall, and with each step the vocalization grew clearer. It was a voice, not just voice-like, not just suggestive of a voice, but an actual vocalization produced by something that had vocal cords, or their equivalent, something that was generating sound that the waterfall was carrying and distorting and scattering but not creating. The source was behind the water, behind the curtain of the fall, in the space between the cascade and the rock face, where a cavity existed that I knew about from previous visits, a shallow overhang that you could theoretically access from the side if the water level was low enough and you were willing to risk the wet rock and the current. I was at the edge of the pool now. The spray was hitting my face and soaking my jacket, and the roar was louder, the individual frequencies separating as I got closer, the bass of the heavy water impact and the hiss of the spray and beneath them, woven through them, the voice. I could almost make out words, syllables that hovered at the edge of comprehension, sounds that my brain kept trying to assemble into language the way your eyes try to assemble the shapes in a cloud into a face. Almost recognizable, almost meaningful. A message that was just beyond the threshold of understanding, as if whoever was speaking was using a language that shared phonemes with English, but wasn't English, or was speaking English that the water was deconstructing into its component sounds and scattering. I leaned forward. My boots were in the water now, the shallow edge of the pool, the current pulling at my ankles. The voice was louder here, clearer, and I was straining toward it the way you strain toward a whisper in a noisy room, tilting my head, concentrating, trying to resolve the signal into meaning. The pool in front of me was dark. Vernal Falls plunge pool is deep, much deeper than it looks from the surface, carved by centuries of water impact into a basin that drops away steeply from the shallow edges. The water was black-green and still at the margins, turbulent at the center where the fall struck, and I was standing at the boundary between shallow and deep, leaning toward the voice, leaning toward the water. Something stopped me. I can't describe it more precisely than that. Un instinct, un réflexe, a message from a part of my brain that was older than language, and that communicated not in words, but in the sudden clenching of my stomach, and the hair rising on my arms, and the absolute certainty that I needed to step back from the water, right now, immediately, without deliberation. It wasn't a thought. It was a command, issued by a system that had assessed the situation faster than my conscious mind could process it, and had concluded that it expressed as raw physical urgency. I stepped back. I took 3 steps backward, out of the pool, away from the edge, and the moment I did, the voice changed. Not in volume or clarity, but in tone. It had been calling, entreating, drawing me forward with the insistence of something that wanted to be heard and understood. Now it shifted to something else. Something that sounded, in the distortion of the waterfall, like frustration or anger, or the sound a thing makes when a mechanism that has always worked suddenly fails. I walked back to my rock. I picked up my pack and my sandwich, and I walked away from Vernal Fall without finishing my lunch and without looking back. The voice continued behind me, audible even at 50 yards, even at 100, the vocalization persisting in the roar of the water, calling, calling, embedded in the white noise like a hook in bait. I hiked back to the trailhead, and half the time it had taken me to climb up. I got in my car and drove to the valley and parked at a pullout and sat there with the engine off and my hands shaking on the steering wheel, and I thought about the pool. I thought about how dark it was, how deep, how the shallow edge where I'd been standing dropped away into a basin that had never been fully measured because the turbulence at the bottom made diving dangerous. I thought about the voice and how it had grown louder as I got closer and clearer, as I leaned toward the water, and how I'd been standing in the pool with the current pulling at my ankles when the instinct hit. The voice wanted me closer. I'm certain of that now with a clarity that I wasn't capable of in the moment. The vocalization, whatever its source, was a lure. It operated on the same principle as a siren in the old myths, embedding itself in a natural sound, using the water as camouflage, drawing the listener forward with the promise of meaning, of comprehension, of the resolution that the human brain craves when it detects a pattern it can't quite complete. Come closer, listen harder, lean in. The words are almost there, the meaning is almost clear. One more step and you'll understand. One more step and you're in water over your head, in a pool so turbulent that the strongest swimmer would be pulled under, in a place where the sound fills your ears and the water fills your lungs, and nobody sees you go because it's October, and the park is empty, and the trail is deserted, and the waterfall roars on, covering whatever sounds you make as the deep takes you down. I went back to Vernal Fall the following spring, in June, when the fall was at full volume, and the trail was packed with tourists, and the mist was thick enough to soak you to the skin. I stood at the base with 100 other people and I listened. Just water. The normal, magnificent, meaningless roar of water hitting rock. No voice, no vocalization, no thread of sound woven through the white noise that suggested something living behind the curtain. I think it's seasonal. I think whatever produces the sound is active in the quiet months, when the park is empty and the trails are deserted, and the solitary hikers who venture to the base of the falls are alone in a way that makes them vulnerable. I think the crowds suppress it, or drown it out, or make it unnecessary because allure works best in isolation. When the prey has no one to grab their arm and say, "Stop, don't go closer," something is wrong with that sound. I don't hike to Vernal Fall in October anymore. I go in summer, when the crowds are thick and the roar is deafening, and the voice, if it's there, can't be heard above the noise of 4 million visitors and the full-throated scream of the Merced River dropping 300 feet onto granite. But sometimes, on quiet nights, I think about the pool. I think about its depth and its darkness and the things that deep water holds that we never see because we stay on the surface and trust the shallows. And I think about the voice, patient and persistent, calling from behind the curtain of the water, waiting for the quiet months, waiting for the empty trails, waiting for the solitary hiker who sits on a rock and eats lunch and hears something in the roar that sounds like language and leans in to listen. Don't lean in. That's what the instinct told me. Don't go closer. Don't try to hear the words. Because the words aren't the point. The water is the point. The deep, dark, turbulent water, where no one can see you and no one can hear you, and the voice that called you in goes silent the moment you're under the surface. And the waterfall roars on, and the pool keeps its secrets. And in October, when the park is empty and the falls run quiet, something speaks through the water and waits for someone to listen. Geocaching is a hobby that people who don't do it find difficult to understand. You drive somewhere, park your car, walk to a specific set of GPS coordinates, and look for a container that someone has hidden there. The container holds a logbook where you sign your name and sometimes small trinkets that you can trade. That's it. That's the whole game. The appeal is in the search, in the satisfaction of following numbers on a screen to a precise point on the Earth's surface and finding something that was placed there for you to find, a small human connection embedded in the landscape. I've been doing it for 8 years, and in that time I've found maybe 2,000 caches in 14 states. Most are mundane, hidden in suburban parks and rest stops, and the bases of light poles in parking lots. But the best ones, the ones that keep me in the hobby, are the deep hides, the caches placed in remote locations that require serious effort to reach, the kind that take you into terrain you'd never visit otherwise, and show you places that exist outside the normal channels of human traffic. I say all this because I need you to understand that I'm not reckless. I'm not the kind of person who follows strangers into the woods on a dare. Geocaching has a community, a set of norms, and a database managed by a company that reviews listings and enforces guidelines. When a cache appears in the database, it's been vetted. The coordinates have been verified. The container has been placed by a registered user whose identity is known to the platform. There are rules, there are systems. And those systems, which had always functioned as a reliable buffer between me and anything genuinely dangerous, failed in April of 2022. The cache appeared on a Thursday. New listings show up in my notifications sorted by proximity, and this one was in the Daniel Boone National Forest, about 2 hours from my apartment in Lexington. The listing was unusual from the start. Most geocachers write detailed descriptions of their hides, including hints about the container type, the terrain, and the approach route. This listing had almost nothing. The cache name was a string of numbers that didn't correspond to any naming convention I recognized. The difficulty rating was 5 out of 5, the highest possible. The terrain rating was also 5. The description field contained a single sentence: "You will not want to find this." I should have been put off by that. Instead, I was intrigued because I'd been geocaching long enough to recognize when someone was trying to create mystique around a hide, and because 5 to 5 caches in national forest land are rare and usually rewarding. The coordinates placed the cache deep in a section of the Daniel Boone that I'd hiked before, an area of steep hollows and sandstone formations and old-growth forest that was remote enough to feel genuinely wild. I marked it as a target for Saturday. I drove to the nearest trailhead early Saturday morning. The weather was overcast, cool for April, the forest still showing the bare bones of late winter with just the first hints of green in the understory. I parked and checked the coordinates on my handheld GPS, orienting myself relative to the trail and the terrain. The cache was about 1.5 miles from the trailhead, but the direct route took me off trail almost immediately, which was expected for a 5-terrain hide. I left the maintained path and started downhill into a hollow that dropped steeply between 2 sandstone ridges. The hollow narrowed as I descended. The ridges on either side pressed closer together, the creek at the bottom cutting through sandstone that rose vertically on both flanks, and the canopy overhead thickened from the open winter structure of the ridgetop to a dense tangle of hemlock and rhododendron that blocked most of the morning light. The ground was damp and covered in last year's leaves, and the creek ran shallow and clear over a bed of flat sandstone slabs. I followed it downstream, checking the GPS frequently, watching the distance to the target decrease with each step. The hollow was quiet in a way that I noticed without attaching significance to, the kind of quiet that deep hollows in Appalachia produce when the terrain blocks wind and the canopy absorbs sound. After about 1 mile, the GPS showed me within 100 feet of the coordinates. The creek had narrowed to a trickle, running through a gap in a sandstone formation where 2 massive slabs of rock leaned against each other, creating a passage maybe 4 feet wide and 8 feet tall. I squeezed through the gap and found myself in a small enclosed space, a natural amphitheater, where the rock walls curved around a floor of flat stone, maybe 15 feet across. It wasn't quite a cave, more of an overhang where the rock formation created a sheltered area, open to the sky on one side but walled on the other 3. The space was dry and dim, the light filtering in from above through a canopy of hemlock branches. The cache container was sitting on a natural shelf in the rock wall, about chest height. A standard military surplus ammo can, olive green, the kind that geocachers use for larger hides. I opened it. Inside was a logbook, a pencil, and nothing else. No trinkets, no trade items, just the logbook. I opened it and flipped through the pages. 7 entries, all dated within the previous month. 7 different usernames. Some I recognized from the local geocaching community, some I didn't. Each entry followed the same format: the finder's name, the date, and a set of coordinates. Not a log of finding this cache, but a set of new coordinates, different from the cache listed location, pointing to somewhere else. Each of the 7 entries contained the same coordinates, the same 12 digits that I copied into my GPS without thinking, because that's what geocachers do. We follow coordinates. It's the fundamental mechanic of the hobby. The new coordinates pointed deeper into the hollow, about a 1/4 mile further downstream, past the rock formation, into terrain that my topographic map showed as increasingly steep and narrow. I should have paused. I should have considered why 7 people had found this cache and recorded new coordinates instead of a normal log entry, and why the cache description had warned me that I wouldn't want to find what I was looking for. But I was in the mode that geocaching puts you in, the focused pursuit of a target that reduces the world to a set of numbers converging on a point, and I followed the coordinates the way I'd followed thousands of coordinates before. The hollow beyond the rock formation was different. The character of the forest changed within 100 yards, the hemlock giving way to older trees that I couldn't immediately identify, species that looked wrong for this ecosystem, trunks that were dark and heavily textured, and that grew so close together the spaces between them were barely passable. The creek disappeared underground, the water sinking into a crack in the sandstone and not re-emerging. The light dimmed further, not from the canopy alone, but from the narrowing of the hollow itself, the ridges converging until the strip of sky above was barely wider than the creek bed below. The GPS showed me closing on the coordinates: 200 feet, 100, 50. I was moving slowly now, the terrain difficult, the footing uncertain on wet rock and loose soil. The smell of the hollow had changed, a damp organic smell that was stronger than the normal forest scent, sweeter, with an undertone that I recognized from somewhere but couldn't place. 20 feet, 10, The coordinates converged, and I stopped. I was standing at the base of a sandstone wall where the hollow terminated in a dead end. The rock face rose vertically for maybe 40 feet, wet with seepage, and at its base was an opening. Not a cave entrance exactly, but a crack in the rock, maybe 3 feet wide and 5 feet tall, leading into darkness. The smell was coming from inside, that sweet organic smell that was stronger here, concentrated, the air exhaling from the crack carrying it in a steady breath. I turned on my headlamp and looked inside. The crack extended back into the rock for maybe 10 feet before opening into a larger space that I couldn't fully see. The floor was dirt and flat stone. The walls were sandstone, wet and close. And on the floor, arranged in a pattern that was too deliberate to be natural, were objects. I'm going to describe what I saw carefully and without embellishment, because the reality doesn't need embellishment. On the floor of that space, in the beam of my headlamp, I could see clothing, shoes, a backpack, a sleeping bag, unrolled and laid flat. Personal items arranged on the stone floor, the way you'd arrange them on a shelf, organized, categorized, and placed with attention. There were multiple sets of belongings, multiple backpacks, multiple pairs of shoes. I counted without entering the space, just standing at the crack and sweeping my headlamp across the floor. 7 backpacks. 7 pairs of hiking boots are arranged in a line. 7 sleeping bags lay out side by side on the stone floor. 7, the same number as the entries in the logbook. The sweet smell was overwhelming now, and I placed it suddenly, the recognition arriving with a physical jolt that made me step backward from the crack. I'd smelled it once before, years ago, when a deer had died behind my apartment building in summer and wasn't discovered for a week. The sweet, dense, unmistakable smell of organic decomposition in an enclosed space. I left. I didn't investigate further. I didn't enter the space. I didn't examine the belongings or look deeper into the crack or do anything except turn around and walk back up the hollow as fast as the terrain allowed, scrambling over rocks and through the narrow passages, back past the rock formation where the cache sat on its shelf, back up the creek drainage, back to the trail and the trailhead and my car. I called the Forest Service from the parking lot, my hands unsteady, my voice conveying enough urgency that the dispatcher transferred me to a law enforcement ranger within minutes. I gave them the coordinates, both sets. I described what I'd seen. I never heard the official outcome. The cache listing was removed from the database within 24 hours. The user account that had posted it was deleted. When I contacted the geocaching platform to ask what had happened, I received a form response stating that the listing had been removed for violating community guidelines and that no further information was available. I checked the local news for weeks afterward. I searched for reports of discoveries in the Daniel Boone National Forest, for missing persons cases closed, and for any acknowledgement that something had been found in that hollow. I found nothing. Whatever the Forest Service found when they followed those coordinates, it wasn't reported publicly, and the silence around it was total and deliberate. I still geocache. The hobby is still what it always was. A reason to go to interesting places, a framework for exploration, a game that takes me outdoors. But I don't follow new listings into the Daniel Boone National Forest. I don't pursue caches with sparse descriptions and maximum difficulty ratings. And when a listing tells me I won't want to find what I'm looking for, I believe it now. Because someone placed that cache. Someone hid an ammo can in a rock formation in a hollow in eastern Kentucky and posted the coordinates to a database that thousands of people use. And inside that cache, 7 people wrote down the coordinates to a place where 7 sets of belongings were arranged on a stone floor in a crack in the rock, and the air smelled sweet and heavy and wrong. 7 people found the cache. 7 people followed the second set of coordinates. 7 sets of gear in that dark space at the end of the hollow. I was number 8. I stood at the crack and looked inside, and smelled what I smelled, and turned around and walked away. And sometimes I wonder about number 9. I wonder if the listing is back up somewhere, under a different name, with a different username, with the same coordinates and the same sparse description, and the same single line that should be a warning but functions as an invitation. You will not want to find this. 7 people didn't listen. I almost didn't listen. And the hollow is still there, still narrow and dark and quiet, still holding whatever it holds at the end where the rock closes in, and the crack in the wall breathes its sweet dead air into the forest. Still waiting for someone to follow the numbers to the end,